I never thought a hiking trip could be anything but a peaceful escape. To me, the woods always represented calm. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, the fresh, earthy smell of pine. Those were the things that drew me to the mountains every year. This trip was supposed to be like any other, a chance to get away from the chaos of daily life, to recharge and get some clarity. But things didn't go as planned. Started off like any normal hike. The morning air was crisp, and I felt the excitement of getting into nature again. I had packed the usual snacks, a couple of water bottles, a first aid kit, and a map. There was no need to overthink it. I knew the trail. I had done it before. The trail I was on, named the Sunset Ridge Trail, was a popular route for hikers. It wasn't too difficult, just a steady incline with a few rocky patches and breathtaking views of the valley below. I set off early, around 7 a.m., wanting to take my time and savor the solitude. The forest was quiet, just the soft crunch of my boots against the dirt path. I had the trail to myself, which was exactly how I liked it. The sun was just beginning to peek over the treetops, casting long shadows across the ground. I adjusted the straps of my backpack and kept walking. The first part of the hike was easy. I moved steadily, my breath coming in slow, measured bursts. I passed by trees that stood like silent sentinels, their bark dark and weathered, roots twisting out of the ground in thick, gnarled tangles. The leaves above me rustled, a gentle reminder of the world around me. As I climbed higher, the trail became steeper, but I was used to it. My legs burned a little, but it wasn't anything I couldn't handle. I paused for a break about halfway up, sitting on a fallen log. The view stretched out before me, fields of wildflowers, the distant mountains hazy in the morning light. It was beautiful, but I couldn't help but notice that the quiet was almost too quiet. No birds, no animals moving through the underbrush. I shook the thought away. It was probably just too early for them. I sipped some water and kept going. As I neared the top, the trail began to narrow, the rocks jutting out from the ground at awkward angles. My steps became more careful, my focus narrowing on the path in front of me. The air was thin up here, and it felt a bit colder. The trees had thinned out, replaced by scrub brush and the occasional rocky outcrop. The higher I went, the more I felt like I was leaving civilization behind. And then it happened. I'd been hiking for a couple of hours when I noticed something odd. There was a small clearing ahead, one I didn't remember from previous hikes. At first, I thought it was just a side trail or some natural feature that didn't stand out before. But when I stepped into the clearing, I felt a strange sense of unease. The ground beneath my feet felt softer here, almost like I was walking on spongy moss. It was different from the usual dry dirt or rocky ground. I looked around, expecting to see the usual trees or boulders, but there was something unsettling about the way the space was laid out. The trees surrounding the clearing were spaced just far enough apart to allow a view of the sky above. But the sunlight didn't reach the ground the way it had earlier. It was almost as if the trees had blocked out the warmth of the sun. There were no birds, no wind, just the eerie silence. I didn't want to stay long. I'd seen enough nature documentaries to know that certain areas of the forest can give off strange vibes. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I moved on, but as I did, I noticed the trail seemed to fade into the underbrush, the markers growing increasingly sparse. This wasn't right. I had been up this trail before and I knew it well. I checked my map to reassure myself, but the path ahead didn't match anything on the map. It was a part of the trail I didn't recognize. I should have turned back. I should have retraced my steps to the last marked section and gone home. But instead, I kept walking, telling myself it was just a mistake. The path had to reconnect with the main trail eventually. I wasn't lost. Not yet. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the trees. The sun was now obscured by clouds, and the air had grown colder still. The strange silence continued, only broken by the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong, but I kept walking. Another hour passed, and I still hadn't seen a single hiker. By now, I should have passed someone. The trail was popular, especially this time of year. Where was everyone? The rocks began to change. They weren't just rocks anymore. They were large slabs of stone, some flat, others angled at odd, unnatural positions. They looked like something out of a geological textbook, and I started to get the uncomfortable feeling that I was no longer on a normal hiking path. The landscape felt wrong. I pulled out my map again. There was no doubt about it, I was off the trail. This wasn't the Sunset Ridge Trail anymore. I had somehow veered off, and the trail I had been following wasn't on the map. I panicked for a moment. My heart raced, and my mind screamed at me to turn back. But I couldn't remember which direction I had come from. I had lost all sense of where I was. I stopped. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating. I looked around, trying to find any landmark I recognized. Nothing. The trees were too similar, the ground too uneven. My stomach twisted into knots as the realization hit. I was lost. Really lost. I had heard about hikers who went missing in these mountains. The woods can be deceptive. It's easy to make a wrong turn or lose track of the path, but getting lost wasn't the worst part. It was the isolation, the feeling of being completely alone, with nothing but the trees and rocks for company. I forced myself to stay calm. Panicking would do no good. I had a map, I had a compass. I could find my way back. I had to. The problem was, I didn't know which way to go. The longer I stood there, the more the trees seemed to close in on me, the shadows stretching longer and longer with every passing minute. I felt like I was being watched, though I saw nothing. It was as if the forest had become alive in a way that made me uncomfortable. I took a deep breath and tried to steady my shaking hands. The best thing to do when lost, they always say, is to retrace your steps. So, I picked a direction, hoping it was the right one, and started walking. The forest didn't look the same in this new direction. The trees seemed more spaced out, the ground rockier. I was sweating now, despite the cold, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. There was no reason to believe someone or something was following me, but that didn't stop the hair on the back of my neck from standing up. Hours passed. I walked and walked and walked some more. The sun was low in the sky, the light fading fast. I needed to make a decision. I needed to find shelter for the night. I couldn't keep walking in circles forever. If I didn't make it back to the main trail before dark, I'd have to hunker down until morning. By now, I had no sense of time. My legs were sore, my head ached, and my throat was dry. I hadn't seen any sign of wildlife or other hikers in hours. My thoughts grew darker with every step. What if I didn't find my way back? What if something happened to me here, in the middle of nowhere? But then, just as I was about to give in to despair, I saw it. A familiar sight, a trail marker. It was faded, weathered, but unmistakable. I wasn't far from the main trail. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears as I hurried toward it, not caring how rough the terrain was. I had found the right path. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't even look back. I just kept walking. My mind focused solely on the marker ahead. The trail finally widened. The trees thinned out, and I could see the familiar path stretching ahead of me. The sun had set completely, but I didn't care. I was back on track. By the time I reached the parking lot, the world was dark. The first stars were appearing in the sky, and I could hear the hum of the distant highway. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day, but I didn't care. I had made it. Safe. I felt relief flood through me. I wasn't lost anymore. I was found. It had been a harrowing experience, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never take nature's beauty for granted again. It could be peaceful and calming, but it could also be unpredictable and unforgiving. I wouldn't be back on that trail anytime soon, but I would be back. Just maybe not alone next time. I had been planning the solo hike for weeks. I'd done solo hikes before, mostly in state parks or well-marked national forest trails, nothing too remote. This time, I wanted something more rugged, more isolated. I'd been reading about a long backcountry trail in the northern part of the state, about 30 miles of wilderness, winding through dense forest, hills, rocky ridges, and no cell signal. It wasn't very popular, which is what drew me to it. I was tired of hearing other people on the trails, tired of passing families with kids and people blasting music from their backpacks. I got off work early on a Friday and drove about 5 hours north to reach the trailhead. It was tucked away off a long gravel forest road. When I pulled into the small parking area, there were only 2 other cars. One of them looked old and covered in dust, probably someone who had been out there for a while. The other was a newer SUV with a bike rack on the back, but no bike. I figured someone had biked in and locked it up deep in the woods somewhere. I checked my gear one last time. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, bear spray, first aid kit, maps, compass, flashlight, extra batteries, multi-tool, and satellite beacon. I didn't want to use the beacon unless I was dying, but I kept it in my pack just in case. I'd left my itinerary with my brother and told him to call for help if he didn't hear from me in 3 days. It was supposed to be a 2-night hike in and out. I hit the trail just before sunset. The forest was quiet, thick with pine trees, low shrubs, and moss that made the air smell earthy and cool. The ground was damp and soft, with long shadows stretching between the trunks. I hiked in for about an hour, just enough to put some distance between myself and the parking lot. I didn't want to camp too close to the road. I set up my tent in a small clearing just off the trail, rolled out my sleeping bag, and ate a cold meal of trail mix and jerky. I didn't make a fire. I rarely do when I'm alone. The glow always feels like a spotlight in the middle of the woods. I crawled into the tent, zipped it up, and listened to the sounds of the forest as night fell. Wind in the branches, an occasional rustle in the leaves, the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful. The first night passed without issue. I woke up early the next morning, packed everything up, and started hiking deeper into the trail. The sun was out, but the tree canopy filtered most of the light, casting a greenish tint over everything. The trail was narrow and sometimes hard to follow, but I kept my map and compass handy. I crossed a few small streams and climbed some steep hills. By midday, I was drenched in sweat. My shirt stuck to my back, and my legs ached, but I felt good. This was what I had wanted. Solitude, nature, a break from the noise of normal life. It was late afternoon when I noticed something that made me pause. A tree beside the trail had deep gashes in the bark, long vertical slashes, like something had clawed at it. They were too high up to be from a small animal. I stared at them for a minute, then shrugged it off. Bears mark trees like that sometimes. I kept walking, but I paid more attention to my surroundings after that. About an hour later, I reached a section of the trail that ran along a narrow ridge. The drop on one side was steep, maybe 30 or 40 feet down a rocky slope. I walked carefully, planting each foot firmly before shifting my weight. My backpack made me feel top-heavy, so I had to keep my balance just right. Halfway across the ridge, I saw something lying in the bushes off the trail. It was a backpack, dark green, partially covered in leaves. It looked like it had been there for a while. I stepped closer and nudged it with my foot. It was empty except for a torn strap and a single sock. No ID, no food wrappers, nothing else. I stood there for a minute, staring at it. I didn't like the way it looked. Abandoned, half-hidden, forgotten. But I told myself it could have been blown there by wind or left behind by someone careless. I moved on. I hiked for another hour before stopping for the night. I picked a flat spot near a stream and set up camp. This time I kept my bear spray closer and tied my food bag high in a tree. I lay in my tent, tired but uneasy. Something about that second day felt off, like I was being watched. I hadn't seen anyone since the trailhead, not a single other hiker, not even footprints or signs of campsites. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was close. Something had stepped on a twig just outside my tent. My eyes snapped open and I held my breath. Then I heard the soft crunch of leaves. Slow, deliberate steps. I reached for the bear spray and held it in my hand. Ready. The sound circled the tent once, then faded into the trees. I didn't sleep again after that. The next morning, I checked the area around my tent. I saw boot prints in the dirt. Just a few, but they were fresh. Not mine. Too big and spaced differently. Someone else had been there. I packed up and got moving fast. I hiked hard, barely stopping, my nerves on edge. Every sound made me jump. Every branch that snapped in the distance made me spin around. I kept checking the trail behind me, half expecting someone to be following. By midday, I came across another odd sight, a pile of stones stacked in the middle of the trail. It wasn't a natural formation. Someone had taken time to arrange them, 10 or 12 flat rocks stacked neatly. I didn't touch them. I just stepped around and kept going. I was planning to hike out completely that day, but around late afternoon, the trail got harder to follow. Parts of it were washed out by erosion. The map didn't match the terrain anymore. I ended up bushwhacking around a fallen tree and somehow lost the trail entirely. I tried to backtrack, but I must have taken a wrong turn. I walked in circles for nearly 2 hours, my legs sore and my water running low. I knew better than to panic, but my chest felt tight. I sat down, looked at the map again, checked the compass. I figured I was about 5 miles from the trailhead, maybe 6. If I could make it to higher ground, I might be able to spot something familiar. I climbed a rocky hill, sweating and stumbling. When I got to the top, I saw more forest stretching out in every direction. Nothing stood out. No signs of the trail. No distant roads or rooftops. Just trees. That night I camped on the hill. I didn't want to, but it was already getting dark. I didn't hear anything strange that night. No footsteps, no rustling. Just wind in the trees. But that almost felt worse. Like the quiet was waiting for something. The next morning, I started hiking west, using the compass to keep my direction steady. I rationed my food, sipped water sparingly, and watched for any signs of the trail. Late in the morning, I found it again. Relief washed over me. I recognized a bend in the path and a downed log I had stepped over the day before. But my relief didn't last. About a mile farther, I spotted another backpack off to the side of the trail. This one was torn open, not just the fabric ripped, like it had been slashed. There was an old sleeping bag nearby, shredded and half buried in leaves. And bones. Small ones, maybe from a deer. At least I hoped so. I kept moving. The trail sloped down into a narrow gully between 2 ridges. The forest felt tighter there, darker. The air was cooler, damper. I passed a cluster of broken branches, snapped high off a tree. Something big had come through here. That's when I heard the sound behind me. Quick footsteps. I turned, but nothing was there. The trees were still. I listened hard, my pulse pounding. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but then I heard them again. Closer. I didn't run. Not yet. I picked up my pace, moving fast but careful. Then the footsteps came again, closer, faster. I ran. I crashed through the trail, lungs burning, pack bouncing on my back. I didn't look behind me. I could hear someone or something moving just behind the trees, matching my pace, following me. I don't know how long I ran. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe 30. Felt like forever. Eventually I stopped, gasping for air, and ducked behind a thick tree. Everything was silent. No more footsteps. Nothing. I waited, clutching the bear spray. Then I saw him, a man standing off the trail about 20 yards back. He wore a dark jacket, dirty jeans, a hood pulled up over his head. He wasn't hiking. No pack, no gear, just standing there, watching. He didn't move. I couldn't see his face, just his shape through the branches. I stayed hidden until he finally turned and walked away, back into the woods. When he disappeared, I didn't wait. I got up and kept going. That night, I didn't set up my tent. I found a small ravine and hid beneath an overhang, wrapping myself in my sleeping bag and staying silent. I didn't sleep. I kept the bear spray in one hand, my flashlight in the other. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps again, crunching leaves, slow and heavy. I had taken solo hikes before, plenty of them. I liked the silence, the rhythm of walking alone in nature, and the feeling of being away from people. I didn't go looking for danger. I picked maintained trails, logged my routes on a hiking app, packed properly, and made sure people knew where I was going. I wasn't reckless, but I wasn't new either. I had experience. That made what happened worse somehow, because I should have seen the signs earlier. It was mid-September when I planned a long hike along Ridge Trail in northern Idaho. The trail ran through the mountains west of Priest Lake, following the spine of the Selkirk Range. I'd never done that stretch before, but I'd read about it in a few backpacking forums. It was listed as difficult, remote, and best tackled by experienced hikers. That was me. I had planned a 3-day solo loop starting at the southern trailhead and circling back by cutting down a narrow connector trail on the 3rd day. The first morning, I got to the trailhead around 6:30 a.m., with my pack already set the night before. It was cold, mid-40s, but the sky was clear and blue. The forecast said no rain for the next 3 days. I wore a wool base layer, a light fleece, and hiking pants, with my rain jacket rolled in the side of my pack just in case. I had a bear canister, a small stove, freeze-dried meals, snacks, a power bank, GPS, knife, headlamp, and extra batteries. My phone had topo maps downloaded offline. I carried a full 3-liter bladder of water and a small filter straw for refill. Everything was checked and rechecked. The first few hours were beautiful. The trail followed a steady incline through dense pine and spruce. I crossed a few narrow streams where the water ran clear and cold over rocks. I saw elk tracks in the mud and once spotted a hawk circling high above a small cliff edge. I stopped at noon and sat on a rock overlooking a wide valley below. From up there, the trees stretched out endlessly in all directions. A sea of green with brown mountain peaks rising out of it like islands. It was quiet, almost too quiet. But that's the kind of quiet you expect out there. The kind that fills your ears like cotton. No cars, no voices, just a bit of wind. By late afternoon, I had climbed high enough that snow patches from the previous week were still lingering in the shady parts of the trail. Nothing deep, just crusty remnants. I reached my planned camp spot just as the sun dipped low behind the mountains. It was a small clearing about 50 feet off the trail, mostly flat, protected by a ring of trees. I pitched my tent, cooked a warm meal, and watched the light fade from pink to gray. The second day is when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first. I broke camp early and climbed higher into the ridge. The trail became narrow and uneven, winding along the edge of steep drops. The trees thinned out and the wind was stronger. I felt more exposed. At one point, I stopped to filter water at a stream that cut across the trail. While crouched down, I thought I heard something, like rocks shifting. I stood up fast and scanned the woods uphill. Nothing, just a few birds hopping in branches, the wind moving through needles. Still, I kept turning back every few minutes as I hiked. I chalked it up to nerves. Later that afternoon, I noticed something that really did bother me. Boot prints. Not mine. They were fresh, in soft dirt, heading in the same direction I was going. At first, that wasn't so strange. It was a public trail. Someone else could have started later or taken a different entry. But I hadn't seen anyone since I parked my car. No other vehicles at the trailhead. No sign of anyone the day before. No wrappers, no broken branches, no voices in the distance. And the weirdest part, there was only one set of prints. No dog, no trekking poles, just wide, heavy boot marks. Still, I kept moving. The trail narrowed again, hugging a cliffside. I had to be careful placing each step. A bad slip and it'd be a long tumble. I tried not to think too much about the prints. That night, I camped at a high saddle between two peaks. Wind cut through the pass hard and constant. I set my tent up in a small dip between rocks, trying to get some shelter. I ate quickly and crawled into my sleeping bag early. My legs were sore and I was tired. The wind howled all night. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started drifting off, I thought I heard something out in the dark. Not animal sounds, more like movement. Slow footsteps on gravel. But the wind distorted everything, and I told myself it was just branches scraping rock or the tent flapping. Just after 3 a.m., I woke up sweating even though the temperature had dropped below freezing. My bladder was full, and I needed to pee. I unzipped the tent, stepped out, and walked a few feet away. The wind had died down to almost nothing. I could hear the trees again, and something else. Movement. I held still, listened hard. gravel shifting, deliberate, slow, close. I turned and scanned with my headlamp. Nothing, just the rocks and trees and darkness. I slowly walked back to the tent, zipped it shut, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind to cut the loop short. There was a secondary trail just a mile ahead that cut downhill to a forest road. It wasn't on most maps, but I had read about it on a local hiking site. Some old logging trail people used to get back to the lower road faster. I figured I could get to the road by afternoon, walk a few miles along it, and hitch or call for a ride back to my car. I didn't want to be out there another night. Not alone. Not anymore. I hiked fast that morning. The trail descended steeply through switchbacks. The trees got thicker again, which should have made me feel safer, but it didn't. I checked over my shoulder constantly. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. Not a bear, not a mountain lion. I had seen enough signs of those before to know what to look for. This was different, too quiet, too precise. At one point, I stopped to listen and heard nothing. No birds, no insects, just wind. That kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. When I reached the connector trail, I saw more of the same boot prints. Same deep treads, still only one set, still going the same way. That meant whoever made them was still ahead of me, or they had looped back. I hesitated at the junction. The main ridge trail continued north. Safer, maybe because it was known, but longer, another night, maybe more. I turned down the connector trail. It was rougher than I expected, less used. Lots of down branches, narrow spots overgrown with shrubs. At one point, I had to scramble down a steep embankment where the trail had washed out. I was halfway down when I slipped and slid several feet on my side, scraping my leg on a jagged rock. Blood soaked through my pants quickly, and I had to sit on a stump to clean and wrap it. Nothing broken, but it hurt to walk. As I got up and started moving again, I heard a noise ahead, a single crack, like a stick breaking underfoot. I froze, then nothing. I moved slowly, keeping low. My breath was short and fast, my hands cold and shaking even with gloves on. I stopped every few yards to listen. The woods were too still. That was the worst part. Nature doesn't just go silent unless something's wrong. About an hour later, I found the first sign that something was very wrong. Just off the trail, tucked behind a mossy stump, was a torn piece of gray nylon. Tent fly. It was frayed at the edges and looked like it had been ripped, not cut. Nearby, buried under pine needles, I saw the glint of metal. I brushed it off, part of a stove. Crushed. Old maybe, but not ancient. A year at most. I searched the area more. Found a rusted tin, some paracord, and what looked like a shredded backpack strap. No sign of the person it belonged to. I moved faster after that, limping through underbrush, ignoring the pain. The trail turned muddy as it descended into a ravine. I slipped more than once, catching myself on tree roots or rocks. My water bladder was nearly empty. I knew I'd hit a stream before the road, so I held off filtering more. I just wanted to get out. I kept catching movement behind me. Shadows. Quick. Always just out of view. Around 2 p.m., I reached the forest road. It was wide, gravel, and empty. No vehicles. No sign of life. I followed it south, watching the tree line constantly. At 3:30 p.m., I found the cabin. It wasn't on any map. It sat about 30 yards off the road, half hidden by trees. An old hunting shack, maybe. Wood walls, slanted tin roof, small porch. The windows were boarded. The door was shut. I don't know why I went near it. Curiosity or stupidity. I walked slowly toward it, scanning for movement. When I reached the porch, I saw more boot prints in the mud. Same tread. I didn't go inside. I turned and started back toward the road when I heard a thud inside the cabin. A chair scraping maybe, or something falling. I ran. I've always liked being alone in the mountains. There's something about being away from everything. No phones, no cars, no noise. Just the sound of wind through trees, the crunch of boots on dirt, and the rhythm of my breath as I hike up narrow trails. I was never the type who needed people around all the time. I liked the quiet and I liked the challenge. It was late September when I planned this hike. I had a 4-day weekend off work and figured I'd spend it doing something I loved. The place I picked was in a remote part of the mountains in northern Idaho. I had done day hikes around that area before, but this time I wanted to really go deep, pack enough food and gear to camp for 3 nights, get into the kind of backcountry where people rarely go. The weather forecast looked fine. Slight chance of rain on the second day, but nothing serious. Nights were supposed to be cool, but I had good gear. A 4-season tent, a solid sleeping bag, and a lightweight stove for hot food. I'd packed dried meals, protein bars, oatmeal, and plenty of instant coffee. My pack was heavy, but manageable. I parked at a trailhead around 6 a.m. on a Thursday. The lot was empty. The sun was just coming up over the treetops. Everything felt perfect. I locked the car, slung the pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The trail climbed steadily for the first few miles. I moved at a steady pace, not fast, just enough to keep warm in the morning chill. My legs were fresh, and the cool air helped. By mid-morning, I was deep into the woods. The trees were thick and tall, mostly pines with some birch mixed in. The trail narrowed in places and twisted around old roots and fallen logs. I had to step carefully sometimes, but I was used to it. I stopped for a quick lunch by a small creek. The water was clear and cold. I filtered a liter, ate a peanut butter sandwich, and sat on a flat rock to rest. Felt good. I hadn't seen or heard another person all day. That afternoon, I kept climbing until I reached a ridge that overlooked a long valley. There was a view of the mountains stretching out in every direction. Far below, I could see a river winding through trees like a silver ribbon. I stood there for a while, just looking out, breathing deep, and listening to nothing but the wind. I made camp near a small alpine lake just before sunset. The water was still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. I set up my tent on a flat patch of dirt about 20 feet from the water, cooked some dehydrated chili on my stove, and watched the sky go orange and pink and then slowly fade to blue. That first night was calm. I slept well. No animals came near the camp. No weird noises, just cold air and a quiet breeze through the trees. The second day, I packed up and hiked farther into the backcountry. The trail I followed wasn't even marked on all maps. It was barely visible in places, just a thin line of trampled grass and old footprints here and there. I liked that. Felt like I was really away from everything. By late morning, clouds started moving in, gray and heavy. The air changed, felt damper, colder. I kept walking. The trees got denser and the trail got rougher. I had to climb over fallen trees, push through branches, and sometimes stop to check my compass and map. But I wasn't worried. I trained for this. I had supplies, a GPS backup, and I knew how to survive outdoors. Around noon, the rain started. Light at first, just a mist. Then it got stronger. I stopped under a big tree and pulled out my rain jacket. The ground was getting muddy, and the trail became slick in places. I moved slower, more carefully. It rained most of the afternoon. I kept hiking, soaked from the waist down. My boots were waterproof, but the water still found a way in. By late afternoon, I reached a narrow pass between 2 ridges. I figured I'd cross through, then descend into another valley where I'd set up my second camp. That was when I heard the low rumble. It wasn't thunder. It didn't roll in the sky. It was deeper, like it came from the ground. I stopped and listened. Came again, louder. The ground trembled slightly under my feet. Then it happened. A crashing sound, like trees snapping, rocks shifting, earth moving. I looked up the slope beside the trail, and I saw it, mud, rocks, branches, all coming down fast. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I dropped my pack and sprinted downhill off the trail, just trying to get away from the slide. It moved fast like a wave. I could hear the crunching and snapping of trees breaking apart, the wet slap of mud hitting rocks. I slipped, fell, rolled down a small embankment, and kept running. When it finally stopped, everything went quiet again. I crouched behind a thick tree, heart pounding, mud on my hands and face. The slope where I'd been standing was gone. Buried under a thick layer of wet earth, broken trees, and rock. My pack was somewhere under that mess. All my food, my tent, my stove, my map, gone. I stood there for a while, trying to figure out what to do. I had nothing except what I had in my jacket. My phone, which had no signal, a folding knife, and a small headlamp. I checked my pockets. A half-empty protein bar. That was it. I couldn't go back the way I came. The trail was gone, blocked by the landslide. I had to go forward, hoping I'd find another way out, or maybe another hiker's camp, or even a service road. I knew there was an old ranger trail somewhere farther north, but I hadn't planned to go that way. I started walking again. No trail now, just wet woods and steep hills. I followed the terrain downward, figuring I'd eventually reach a stream or river that I could follow. Water usually led somewhere. The rain kept coming. My clothes were soaked. My boots squished with every step. My fingers were cold and stiff. The protein bar didn't help much. I tried to stay focused, but the cold made it harder to think. I kept moving, though. I didn't want to stop. I knew if I stopped too long, I'd start shivering, and once that started, it wouldn't stop. By nightfall, I found a small overhang near a rock wall. It wasn't much, but it kept the rain off me. I piled up pine needles and dry leaves the best I could and curled up in my jacket. Couldn't sleep. I was too cold, too hungry. I just closed my eyes and waited for the night to end. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but everything was soaked. My joints ached from the cold. My hands were swollen and stiff. I started walking again downhill, sticking to open spaces where I could move easier. I drank from a stream. The cold water hurt my teeth. I tried to chew on pieces of dry pine bark just to have something in my mouth. It didn't help. I walked all day, weak and shaking, looking for anything. A sign, a clearing, even just a fresh footprint. Nothing, just endless forest. I saw no animals, no people, no shelters. I was alone. That night, I didn't find shelter. I curled up beside a tree and wrapped my arms around my knees. I couldn't stop shivering. My mind started drifting. I had strange dreams even while awake. Memories of warm food, soft beds, people laughing. My body felt numb. My lips were cracked. My boots had started to come apart at the seams. On the fourth day, I could barely walk. My legs shook with every step. I kept slipping on the wet ground. I started talking to myself. Not real words, just mumbling. My stomach felt like a hollow pit. My tongue was dry even after I drank. I don't remember falling. I just remember waking up on my back, staring at the sky through the trees. My head throbbed. I tried to sit up, but everything spun. I stayed there a long time, maybe hours. I don't know. When I finally stood up, I saw something that made my heart jump. A fence. Old and broken, but a fence. I staggered toward it. It ran along a low hill, and beyond it was a dirt road. Not a trail, not a game path, a real road. I followed it step by slow step. I walked for what felt like hours. Then I saw it. An old cabin boarded up, but real. There was a rusted-out truck parked beside it. No one was there, but I found a shed with a tarp inside, and I used it as a blanket. I stayed there that night, too weak to keep going. The next day, I kept walking the road. I don't know how far. Eventually, a truck came. A man inside looked shocked when he saw me. He helped me into the truck, gave me water, and drove me to a small town an hour away. I don't remember much of the ride. I spent 3 nights in a hospital. Dehydration, hypothermia, exhaustion. The doctor said I was lucky I didn't have frostbite or worse. They gave me food, blankets, and time to rest. I slept for almost a full day the first night. When I finally got home, everything felt strange. The walls, the lights, the sound of traffic. Took time to feel normal again. I had nightmares for a while. About the slide, about being alone in the cold, about never finding a way out. But I was lucky. I made it out. I went back months later to find the spot where I dropped my pack. The whole slope was still torn up. Trees uprooted, rocks everywhere. My pack was never found. I don't hike alone anymore. I parked my truck on the edge of a dusty gravel turnout just off a narrow forest road in the northern part of Idaho. I had been planning this solo hike for over a month. The idea was simple. 3 days out in the forest with everything I needed on my back. I wasn't taking any official trail, just following an old logging road for a while, then cutting into the deep woods toward a ridge I had seen on a topographic map. It was far from towns, far from campsites, and far from people. That was the point. I had enough water to start, a lightweight filter, a first aid kit, a GPS unit, paper maps, and backup batteries. I had a solid tent, a bare canister, my food divided into days, and enough layers to handle cold nights. I was in decent shape too. I'd done longer hikes. I wasn't afraid of animals or weather. The thing I overlooked was how far I'd really be from any help if something went wrong. By the time I locked up my truck and hoisted the pack onto my shoulders, it was mid-morning. I crossed under some old downed power lines, followed the logging road up a gentle slope, and then passed into thick pine and fir forest. The smell of sap and dry needles filled the air. It was warm but not too hot, and my boots crunched softly on the shaded ground. Birds flitted through the trees. Squirrels scattered. Felt peaceful. The first day went just like I hoped. I made steady progress through a gently climbing valley, stopped for a lunch of jerky and trail mix on a mossy rock, and then pressed on until I found a small creek I'd marked on my map. It was still flowing, just a trickle in places, but clean enough to filter. I filled up, boiled water for dinner, and set up my tent in a grove just off the bank. That night, I sat on a flat stone and watched the sky darken between the tree branches. No bugs, no sounds except for wind in the leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I zipped myself into my bag and fell asleep easily. The next morning, I packed up before the sun was high. The plan was to follow the creek upstream and make it to the base of the ridge by evening. From there, I'd climb the following day and make camp at the top. The creek wound tightly through the trees, and the underbrush got thick fast. I had to push through ferns and low bushes, step over fallen logs, and at one point scramble up a narrow slope with my hands gripping exposed roots. The GPS still worked fine. I checked it every hour or so to make sure I was on track. It was around mid-afternoon that I found the dead elk. It was lying in a shallow dip near the stream bed, half in the water. Its rear legs were twisted underneath it, and its head was turned at an unnatural angle, neck bent too far. The body was bloated slightly, but it wasn't rotting yet. Flies buzzed around its eyes. I couldn't see any obvious injuries, no blood, no torn flesh, just dead. It had probably slipped trying to cross the stream and broken its neck. It gave me a weird feeling, though. There weren't any predator marks, no scavenger bites. Nothing had touched it. That was the strange part. I moved on quickly after that. I didn't like standing near a fresh carcass, especially out here. Something could come sniffing. I kept checking over my shoulder as I hiked away. I made camp early that night, stopping in a flat spot on a rise above the creek. I didn't want to be near that elk when the light started to go. I barely ate anything and didn't bother with a fire. I just lay in the tent listening to the sounds around me, every crack of a twig sharper than usual. I slept badly. My mind kept going back to that elk. I thought I heard movement outside the tent several times, but when I unzipped the flap and shined my headlamp, I didn't see anything, just shadows and trees and my breath in the cool air. The next morning, I felt groggy and a little off. Still, I packed up and kept going. I was close to the base of the ridge now. I started to climb a steeper section of forest, using a switchback pattern and checking the map. There was no trail, just patches of hard soil between roots and rocks. After an hour or so, I reached a small open ledge where I could see the slope behind me and some of the valley below. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were on the same slope I had just climbed, scattered, light but definitely there. Footprints, not boot prints, bare feet, human-sized. The soil was dry, so they weren't sharp, but I could make out the heel and toes in a few of them. They weren't mine. I had been zigzagging the slope carefully, and these prints crossed my path at a different angle. I stared at them for a long time. They didn't make any sense. Who hikes out here barefoot? And where did they come from? I hadn't seen any other cars on the forest road. I hadn't passed a soul in 2 days. I hadn't even heard a plane overhead. I kept going because what else was I going to do? but I kept checking over my shoulder more often now. Every time I stopped to rest, I scanned the trees. I reached the top of the ridge around late afternoon. The wind was stronger up here, and the trees were more spread out. I found a clearing between two large rocks and set up camp. I could see the sun dipping behind the next ridge line. It should have felt like an achievement, but I just felt tense. I skipped dinner again. I didn't want to deal with the stove or the smell of food. I climbed into my tent early and tried to read a few pages from a paperback I had brought. I couldn't focus. That night was worse. I woke up sometime past midnight. Something had snapped a branch near the tent. It wasn't wind. It was deliberate, heavy. I didn't move at first. I just lay still, heart racing. Then I slowly reached over and unzipped my sleeping bag. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife. Not that a knife would help if it was a bear, but it made me feel better. I held my breath and listened. Something crunched in the leaves just outside. Then it stopped. I didn't hear it move away. I didn't hear anything for several minutes. I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent flap just an inch and shine the light out. Nothing. I checked both sides, made a full circle with the beam. Still nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting cross-legged with the light in one hand and the knife in the other. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a tiny sound, wind, a twig, an animal, and jolt awake again. When daylight finally came, I packed up in a rush. I didn't eat. I didn't care. I just wanted to get down the ridge and start back toward the truck. That's when I noticed the rocks. They were arranged in a neat little pile, maybe 10 feet from where my tent had been. 4 of them stacked vertically like a tiny totem. I hadn't seen them the night before. Someone had been there. I kicked the rocks apart and left without looking back. I descended the ridge quickly, faster than I should have. I slipped once and scraped my palm, but I didn't stop. My GPS still worked, so I stayed on course, heading back toward the creek. The sun rose higher, and the heat came with it. I ran out of water around midday and stopped at the stream to filter more. I tried to calm down, told myself maybe it was another hiker playing a prank. Or maybe someone was squatting out there, off the grid. Still weird, but not dangerous. I saw the same dead elk on the way back. Only now it was torn open. Something had ripped its stomach wide. The ribs were cracked. The guts were mostly gone. There were deep claw marks on the flanks and dried blood all around. Flies swarmed in thick clouds. The stink was overwhelming. I didn't stay long. I moved faster after that. That night, I camped further downstream, closer to the old logging road. I built a fire this time. I wanted light. I wanted smoke. I stayed awake as long as I could, just sitting on a log with my back to a tree, watching the dark. Sometime around midnight, I heard something scream. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a mountain lion. I'd heard those before. This was human. A man's scream, distant but not that distant, echoing through the trees. I didn't sleep again. I just sat there, gripping my knife and watching the fire die. At dawn, I ran. I didn't hike. I ran, my pack bouncing on my back, legs burning, lungs aching. I followed the old road back to the forest road where my truck was. I reached the turnout just past noon, but my truck wasn't there. The gravel was empty. There were no tire tracks either. No sign anyone had been there in days. For a moment, I thought I had the wrong place, but I checked the GPS coordinates. It was the exact spot. I stood there, drenched in sweat, staring at the empty clearing. I walked the edge of the road for nearly 2 hours, looking for any other turnouts, any sign of my vehicle. Nothing. I was 10 miles from the nearest ranger station. My phone had no signal. That night, I didn't camp. I just sat on a rock with my back to a tree, no fire, no food, just holding the knife and listening. I heard footsteps at some point, not animal footsteps, human ones, light, careful. They circled me in the dark, just out of view. Every time I turned my head, the sound would stop. I didn't sleep. At first light, I started walking down the forest road. I followed it for hours, feet blistered, shoulders aching. It was supposed to be a simple hike, the kind you do just to clear your head, escape the noise of daily life, and enjoy some peace. That's all I wanted. Nothing fancy, just a few hours on a well-marked trail to disconnect. It wasn't even supposed to be a hard hike. My destination was the summit of Mount Silverstone, a popular spot a few hours outside of town. My buddies had hiked it a few times and said it wasn't too bad. Nothing that would leave me gasping for air or stuck in any kind of danger. It sounded perfect. I woke up early, the kind of early that feels like the world is still asleep. The weather forecast had promised clear skies, which was perfect for a hike. The air was crisp as I threw my backpack over my shoulder and double-checked the essentials. Water, some snacks, a map, my phone, and a small first aid kit. I had a basic route in mind: take the main trail to the summit and loop around to the back, where a small, lesser-known path would lead me back down. I wasn't really expecting much. I just wanted to clear my head. Lately, I'd been feeling off, tired, out of focus, and I figured a bit of time in nature might do the trick. As I parked my car at the trailhead, the area was almost completely deserted. Just a couple of cars parked along the edge of the lot, but nobody around. That suited me just fine. I liked the idea of being alone, just me and the trees. The trail was well defined, winding through thick forest and up the mountain. First, everything felt fine. The forest was quiet, but not in an eerie way. Just the usual sounds of birds chirping and the wind rustling through the branches. The kind of quiet that lets your thoughts wander without distraction. I kept a steady pace, trying to push myself just enough to feel like I was getting a good workout, but not so much that I'd tire myself out early. After about an hour of hiking, the scenery began to change. The trees became more sparse, and the trail started to climb more steeply. It wasn't hard, but the effort required to keep my footing started to increase. My breathing became deeper, my legs a little more sore. I wasn't in the best shape, but I was doing fine, still confident that I could make it to the top without much trouble. But then, as I neared the halfway point, something shifted. It wasn't anything big, just a sense that things weren't quite as they should be. I stopped for a moment, catching my breath and looking around. The woods seemed to close in on me, more dense than I remembered from earlier. The trail, which had been so clear at the beginning, seemed to twist and turn in strange ways, and the path ahead felt less distinct. I shrugged it off at first. It was probably just me being tired, nothing more. But as I pressed on, it became more difficult to ignore. The woods weren't just quieter, they felt still. No birds, no rustling leaves. Even the wind seemed to have stopped completely. It was then that I realized how much I had been relying on the sounds of nature to keep me company. With everything silent around me, I felt exposed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I kept moving, trying to shake the unease creeping in, but something was wrong. The trail seemed to go on forever without any clear end in sight, and the further I went, the more it felt like the woods were closing in on me, making it harder to see where I was headed. By now, I had already been hiking for almost 2.5 hours. I should have been near the summit by now, but the path just kept twisting, turning, and climbing without any sign of the peak. My phone had no service, and my map seemed unhelpful. I wasn't lost, but I definitely didn't feel like I was on the right path anymore. I stopped to drink some water, my hands shaking slightly as I took a swig. I was thirsty, far more than I should have been. Maybe it was the altitude or the lack of wind, but my throat felt parched, and my stomach was starting to feel uneasy. Still, I told myself to keep going. I wasn't going to turn back just yet. As I continued up the trail, I noticed a small side path to my left. It wasn't marked, but it was faintly visible through the trees, just enough for me to see that it led somewhere. I considered it for a moment. The main trail had been so winding and unclear that this smaller path might offer a shortcut. Maybe it would bring me to the summit more directly. The decision to take the side path seemed small, almost trivial. But it wasn't. The path wasn't what I expected. The trees on either side grew thicker, their trunks closer together. The ground became rockier, more uneven. The further I went down the path, the more isolated I felt. There were no signs of other hikers, no sounds of birds or insects. The air felt heavier, thicker. It wasn't oppressive, exactly, but the silence had become unnerving. I walked for what felt like another hour, but I hadn't made much progress. The trees had become so dense that I couldn't see beyond them. The light filtering through the canopy had turned dim, casting long shadows that stretched across the trail. I was beginning to feel the weight of the hike, the exhaustion setting in. And then it happened. My foot slipped on a loose rock, and I tumbled forward, crashing to the ground. My hands shot out to break my fall, but the impact still rattled me. The air whooshed out of my lungs as I lay there, flat on my stomach, staring at the ground. I laid there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to steady myself. I wasn't hurt, but my pride was bruised. I slowly pulled myself to my feet, wiping dirt from my hands and checking my knees. My phone fell from my pocket during the fall, and when I picked it up, the screen was cracked. Great. I was angry now, frustrated with myself. But there was no turning back. The path ahead was still unclear, but I had to keep moving. So I pushed forward. But the path began to feel more and more like a maze, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around several times, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. The only movement in the forest was the sway of the trees, and even that felt like it was in slow motion. Time seemed to stretch in weird ways. I was no longer certain how much time had passed since I started the hike. Could have been 5 hours, or it could have been 10 minutes. I didn't know. All I could focus on was getting back to the trailhead, but the path was twisting, disorienting me more with every step. Then, after another stretch of time, I saw something up ahead, the glint of light. It was distant but unmistakable, a clearing, maybe. I quickened my pace, desperate for anything that resembled civilization or an exit from the dense woods. I stumbled out of the trees, blinking as I emerged into an open meadow. The sky above was wide and clear, and for the first time in hours, I felt a sense of relief. I had no idea where this place was, whether it was a designated part of the trail or just some random clearing, but I didn't care. It was then I saw the sign, just a small wooden board that had been weathered by years of exposure. The words were faded, but it was still legible. Mount Silverstone's summit, 3 miles. I had made it. Somehow, I had reached the summit. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and stood there for a moment, taking in the view. The mountains stretched out ahead of me, and below, the valley spread wide and far. I wasn't sure how I'd gotten here, but at least I was at the top. The feeling of accomplishment washed over me in waves, and I felt the tension in my body begin to ease. After sitting there for a while, I turned around to head back. The trail I had originally come from was still visible, and though it seemed just as dark and dense as before, I didn't feel the same unease as I had on the way up. I walked down the mountain slowly, taking care not to repeat my earlier mistake. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead that I realized just how far I had hiked off course. When I finally reached my car, my legs were sore, but I was grateful to be back. I would never hike that path again, but at least I made it. It was early morning when I decided to go for the hike. I had spent the previous night in the small cabin I'd rented for the weekend. The air was crisp, with a chill that made me zip up my jacket as I packed my backpack. I didn't expect much from the hike. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, and nothing too strange had ever happened. But this time felt different. The weather was perfect for a hike, and I had a route in mind that would take me through some old, remote trails in the woods. The sun had barely risen, and the faint orange glow of the early morning was creeping over the horizon. I could feel the cool air on my skin as I stepped out of the cabin and into the woods. The ground was still damp from the morning dew, and the trees stood tall around me, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. The quiet was comforting, like the forest was greeting me, but there was an underlying stillness that made me uneasy. It felt like the kind of silence you get just before something happens, the kind of silence that makes you question whether you're truly alone. I started off down the trail, the path soft beneath my boots. The dirt was packed tightly, with small patches of grass here and there. The trees around me were dense, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the light, leaving the forest floor dim and shaded. Birds chirped from high above, and every now and then, a twig would snap underfoot, causing me to glance around nervously. The further I went, the quieter the forest seemed to get. The sounds of the birds faded, and the breeze slowed, leaving everything still. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the trail began to narrow. The trees grew closer together, their branches interlacing overhead, making it feel like I was walking through a tunnel. It wasn't a path that was frequently used, but it didn't bother me. I liked being alone in places like this, away from the noise and distractions of the world. I had brought along my phone, but I wasn't using it to check maps or make calls. It was just for emergencies, though I didn't think I would need it. I hadn't noticed how far I had gone until I reached a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a break in the trees, but I felt a slight shift in the air. It wasn't a feeling of dread exactly, but more of a quiet alarm that something wasn't quite right. I stopped for a moment to take in my surroundings. The clearing was surrounded by thick trees, and there was a stream running nearby. The sound of the water was soothing, and the quietness of the place seemed to draw me in. I stepped forward, my boots crunching on the dry leaves beneath me. The sun had climbed higher, and the light filtered through the branches, casting long shadows across the ground. There was something odd about the way the light fell in this spot. It didn't feel natural, like the forest had an odd way of bending light around certain areas. I tried to brush off the thought, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching me, that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I pushed forward, my pace quickening as I tried to focus on the trail ahead. The trees seemed to loom closer as I moved deeper into the woods, their trunks growing thicker and darker as the light faded with each step. The path had become more uneven, with rocks and fallen branches scattered along the ground. I had to be careful where I stepped, my boots slipping a few times on the wet rocks near the stream. The air had grown colder as I walked, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. It was at this point that I first heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the rustling of leaves and the trickling water. It was a low, guttural noise, almost like a growl, but too distant to make out clearly. I stopped and looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The forest was still too still. I strained my ears, hoping to catch another sound, but all I could hear was the wind moving through the branches. I chalked it up to my imagination running wild. After all, I was in the woods. There were bound to be strange noises. I pressed on, but the sense of unease only grew stronger as I continued. It was like something was just out of sight, something I couldn't quite place. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was being irrational, but it was hard to ignore the way the trees seemed to bend in odd angles, the way the shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground. The path had become more overgrown, and I had to push aside branches as I walked. Then I heard it again. This time it was closer, louder. It wasn't a growl. It was more like a scraping sound, like something heavy dragging across the ground. My heart started to race as I slowed my pace, straining my eyes to see through the dense foliage. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was undeniable. It came from behind me, moving through the underbrush. I froze, trying to listen. There was no other sound. No birds, no wind, just the rustling in the woods. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I slowly turned around. The trees around me felt darker now, the light dimming as the sky grew clouded. For a brief moment, I wondered if I should turn back, but I wasn't sure if I could. I had already come so far, and I didn't want to feel like I was running away from something I didn't understand. I took a step forward, then another, my feet moving cautiously through the leaves. The sound had stopped, but the air felt heavier, more oppressive. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I continued along the trail, hoping to get a glimpse of whatever had made the noise. That's when I saw it, a shape. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I realized it was moving. A shadow low to the ground, creeping between the trees. I stopped again, my heart pounding in my chest. The shape was too dark, too solid to be a trick of the light. It was something out there, something alive. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward. But with every step I took, the shape moved further into the trees, always staying just out of sight. I couldn't see what it was, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me, studying me. My skin prickled with fear as I reached a bend in the trail. The shape was gone, but the air still felt thick, like something was waiting. I was almost to the end of the trail when I heard the crunch of leaves behind me. It wasn't distant this time. It was close and it was moving fast. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the same dense trees, the same quiet woods. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. Had I imagined it? Was it some animal? No, this was different. This felt deliberate, like something was intentionally trying to stay hidden from me. I didn't know how much further I could go, but I had to get out of there. My body was trembling now, my senses on high alert. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the leaves, made me jump. I had to move faster, get back to the cabin. I turned and started walking briskly, trying not to panic. My breath came in short bursts, and my heart pounded in my chest. The path seemed to stretch on longer than I remembered. The trees felt closer, the shadows darker. I wasn't sure if I was going in circles or if I had just become disoriented, but the sense of being followed didn't go away. It lingered, hanging over me like a weight. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the clearing ahead. The stream was in sight, and I knew I was close to the cabin. But just before I reached the open area, I heard something again. The scrape. This time it was louder, more distinct. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I reached the cabin as quickly as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my hands shaking. I sat on the floor, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't stop the feeling of being watched. It was like something was out there, waiting, just beyond the edge of the trees. I eventually fell asleep, exhausted, and when I woke, it was late afternoon. The sky was clear, and the forest outside seemed calm, peaceful. But something had changed. I didn't know what, but I felt different. I wasn't sure what I had heard or what had been following me, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back into those woods again. I had been feeling overwhelmed for weeks. My job had become stressful, the kind of stress that doesn't go away when you clock out. I wasn't sleeping well. My thoughts kept racing at night. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about deadlines and people I didn't like and things I should have said differently in meetings. My heart always felt heavy, like I was dragging around something I couldn't explain to anyone. So I decided to take a break from everything. I picked a remote trail I found online, one that didn't seem too popular but had just enough reviews to let me know people had done it before. It was in a dense forest area up north, about 6 hours from where I lived. It was called Pine Loop Ridge, and the hike was supposed to be a 2-day round trip if you did the full loop. I planned to hike to the far side, camp overnight, and then head back the next day. I left early on a Friday morning, just after sunrise. I packed light but brought all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, water purifier, GPS, map, compass, some high-calorie food, and a first aid kit. I also had a battery pack for my phone, though I didn't expect reception out there. I didn't tell too many people about the trip, just left a note for my neighbor letting her know I'd be gone for a few days. That was a mistake. By noon, I reached the trailhead. There was no one else parked at the small gravel lot. The air smelled fresh, the way it only does when you're far away from traffic and people. I shouldered my pack and started hiking. The trail was narrow and slightly overgrown, but it was still visible. I liked that. It meant fewer people had been through recently. The trees stood tall and thick, casting long shadows even though the sun was high. The trail started off easy, just some mild inclines, a few rocky patches, and a lot of dense greenery on both sides. The only sounds were birds and the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt. A few hours in, I stopped for lunch by a small stream that ran across the trail. I filtered some water, ate a protein bar, and checked the map. Everything seemed fine. I was about a third of the way to the halfway point, where I planned to make camp. That's when I noticed something odd. Just ahead of where I sat, across the stream, the trail seemed to split. That wasn't on the map. I walked across to take a closer look. One path continued straight, as expected, but the other turned off sharply and dipped into a thicker part of the woods. It didn't look like an animal path. It had been cleared not by machines but by people. Small branches had been cut clean. There was even a faint sign of old footprints, though it was hard to tell for sure. I knew I should have ignored it, but something about it caught my curiosity. Maybe it was the mental fog I had been in for weeks, or maybe it was just the instinct that tells you to check out what others might miss. I decided to follow it just for a bit to see where it led. I figured if it didn't lead anywhere interesting, I'd double back and get back on the main trail. The path got narrow quickly. The trees closed in on both sides, and the light dimmed even though the sky was clear. I walked for maybe 10 minutes before I found something that made me stop cold. There was a campsite, but it was old and abandoned. Collapsed tent, torn and faded. A rusty fire pit surrounded by stones. Empty food cans, some smashed and half buried in dirt. The grass had grown around everything. It hadn't been used in a long time, but it didn't look like someone had packed up and left. It looked like someone had disappeared. I stood there for a long minute. Something about the place felt wrong, not in a supernatural way, but in a practical, gut-level way. Like I had stepped into something that didn't want to be found. I turned back. That's when I realized I couldn't find the path I had come in on. I walked in a circle, scanning the trees and the undergrowth, trying to retrace my steps. But the ground all looked the same. The way I had come in was gone, swallowed by the forest. I wasn't panicked yet, but I felt my pulse quicken. I pulled out the compass and checked my direction. I knew the main trail ran east to west, so I aimed west and began walking, figuring I'd eventually cross it again. But I didn't. I walked for nearly an hour. The forest only got thicker. I was sweating hard now, swatting at bugs, and the sky had started to dim slightly, just enough to remind me that sunset wasn't far off. I decided to stop and set up camp before I lost light completely. I found a small clearing, pitched my tent, and ate a little. I didn't feel like eating much. That night, I barely slept. There were noises in the woods, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Not loud, not all at once, just random sounds. I told myself it was wildlife, squirrels, maybe a deer, but it didn't feel like that. The sounds came from all around, not just one place. Like something or someone was circling slowly. At one point, I thought I saw a shape between the trees, not moving, just standing there. I stared at it for a long time, then it was gone. By morning, I was a mess. My nerves were fried. I packed up quickly and started walking again, heading west. I checked my GPS, but the screen was frozen. The battery pack wouldn't charge it for some reason. I tried not to think too hard about it. Around midday, I came across something even worse. It was another trail, but it wasn't part of the official loop. This one had signs, wooden posts with red cloth tied around them, spaced every 20 or 30 feet. Someone had marked this path deliberately, but it wasn't on any map. There were boot prints, fresh ones, not hiking shoes, heavy boots, the kind you might see on construction workers or military people. I should have turned around. I didn't. I kept going, curiosity mixing with fear. After a few hundred feet, the trail opened into a wide area that looked like a hunting camp, but bigger, messier, more permanent. There were wooden structures, not buildings, more like shacks and raised platforms. There were bones scattered near one of the fire pits. Not animal bones. At least they didn't look like animal bones. There were also cages, 2 of them, heavy steel ones, the kind you'd use to trap a bear. One of them was closed, the other open. Both were empty. The place reeked of old blood and smoke. Then I saw the cameras. Small trail cameras mounted to trees, half covered with branches. I was standing right in their view. I backed up slowly, heart pounding. That's when I heard the noise. A snapping sound like a stick breaking underfoot. Not mine. Then another, closer. Then silence. I turned and ran. I didn't stop to think. I just ran as fast as I could, crashing through undergrowth, branches tearing at my arms and legs. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I I crawled under a fallen log and lay still, trying to listen. For a long time, there was nothing. Then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate footstep. Just one. Then another. I stayed there until dark. I didn't move. I barely breathed. When night came, I crept out and moved again. I didn't know where I was going anymore. I was just trying to get away from that place. I hiked all night, guided only by the stars. At some point, I tripped and hit my head. I don't know how long I was out. I woke up with dried blood on my forehead and a throbbing pain in my skull. The next day, I found a stream and followed it downhill, hoping it would lead to a road or a trail. I drank straight from it, not even bothering to filter. I was too thirsty, too tired. Sometime in the afternoon, I saw a cabin. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. It was small and old, tucked between trees. No lights, no smoke. I walked up slowly, knocked, then pushed the door open. It was empty, just a cot, some shelves, and a broken radio. But there were maps on the wall. I studied them for over an hour. They were old, but they showed the full area, including trails I hadn't seen before. I found a line that matched the stream I had been following. I saw where it crossed a dirt access road, about 5 miles away. I marked it in my mind. I spent one more night in that cabin, too afraid to light a fire. I kept the door bolted and stayed awake, listening. The next morning, I left early. I followed the stream again, pushing through thick brush, stumbling and falling, until finally I reached the road. An old Ranger truck passed by an hour later. I flagged it down. The man who picked me up said I was 12 miles off course. He said the area I had come from wasn't part of the official trail anymore. It had been closed years ago after a series of disappearances. I didn't tell him what I saw. I just said I got lost. He dropped me off in town. I checked into a motel, washed off the dirt and blood, and slept for almost 18 hours. When I got home, I reported what I found to the authorities, anonymously. I never heard anything back. It's been months now. I still go hiking, but I stick to marked trails. I don't explore side paths. I don't follow strange markings. And I never hike alone anymore, because somewhere in that forest, someone built traps for people. And I was lucky to escape one. The first mistake I made was thinking that the trail would be easy. I had been hiking plenty of times before, so I figured I knew what I was doing. My backpack was light, filled with just the basics: a water bottle, a first aid kit, some snacks, and my phone. The plan was simple: a day hike through a well-known trail with a steady climb to the summit, and then back by sunset. I wasn't expecting anything to go wrong, but as I learned, nothing ever goes exactly as planned. It was late spring, and the weather was perfect. The sun was out, but it wasn't too hot yet. The air crisp and fresh. The trees were all lush and green, and the flowers along the trail were starting to bloom. I felt confident as I drove to the trailhead, parked my car, and set off down the path. The trail was well marked, and there were a few other cars parked around, so I didn't think twice about going alone. The first couple of miles were easy. The trail was wide, the incline gentle. I passed a few other hikers, some older couples, and a father with his kids, all of them smiling, all of them excited about the hike. There was nothing to worry about. The trees overhead formed a canopy, blocking out the direct sun, and I felt cool as I walked. The sound of birds chirping filled the air, and the occasional rustling of leaves was a comforting sound, a reminder that I wasn't alone. By the time I reached the first real incline, I was starting to feel the burn in my legs, but it wasn't too bad. I stopped a few times, took some sips of water, and just enjoyed the view. From here, I could see the valley below, the patches of farmland, and the distant mountains in the distance. It was quiet except for the sound of the wind. But then, as I pushed onward, I started to notice something strange. The forest was growing denser, the trees taller and more packed together. The trail, which had once been wide and easy to follow, was starting to narrow. It was still marked, but the markings weren't as frequent. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I realized that the trail was becoming harder to follow. The dirt path underfoot had begun to disappear into thick roots and rocks. It was obvious that fewer people had hiked this section in a while. I checked the time. It was about midday. I still had plenty of daylight left, so I pressed on. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves started to fade. I wasn't sure why, but the silence seemed unnatural. The trees seemed closer now, the air heavier, as though the forest was wrapping around me, enclosing me. The hike, which had started as a peaceful journey, was becoming uncomfortable. After about an hour of struggling through the dense woods, I stumbled upon a fork in the trail. There was no sign, nothing to indicate which way to go. I stared at the two paths for a while, trying to remember the map I had studied before leaving, but nothing about the terrain looked familiar. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I didn't want to turn back. I'd come this far. I needed to push through. I chose the path to the left, thinking it would lead me to the summit. The trail, if you could even call it that, was barely visible now. The trees had thickened, the underbrush more tangled. My feet caught on roots, and I had to be careful not to trip over rocks. It was slow going, and I started to feel a sense of unease. I had no idea how far I had gone, but I could tell I was no longer on a well-maintained trail. The silence was eerie, and the feeling of being watched crept over me. I tried to push it away, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling. Then I heard something. It was faint at first, but it was definitely there. A low, distant sound, like a branch cracking, followed by something heavy dragging through the underbrush. I froze, my heart pounding. I glanced around, but the trees were so thick I couldn't see much. The sound didn't come again, and I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. I wasn't far from civilization, after all. I wasn't alone. Still, my pulse quickened, and my steps slowed. The trail seemed to go on forever, and I was starting to feel like I had made a huge mistake by not turning back earlier. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out. No service. I checked again, nothing. I wasn't surprised, considering how far I was from the main trail, but the feeling of isolation sank deeper. I kept walking, but the path grew steeper. Every few steps, the forest seemed darker, the trees thicker, and I had to push aside branches just to keep moving forward. It was like I was walking through a tunnel of green, the sky no longer visible. The sun had shifted, and the temperature had dropped slightly, making the air feel colder and damp. The wind had picked up, too, rustling the leaves and making the trees groan. Then, without warning, I heard it again, this time much closer. A heavy thud followed by a rustle of leaves. I spun around, but again, I saw nothing. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded more deliberate. Something or someone was moving through the trees, and I wasn't sure if it was heading toward me or just circling around. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, trying to listen, trying to make sense of what was going on. There were no more sounds of birds or animals now, just the occasional crack of a branch and the rustling of leaves. My nerves were shot, and I knew it wasn't just my imagination anymore. Something was off. I decided to keep moving. The panic was starting to build, but I couldn't afford to lose control. I had to get out of this forest. I needed to find my way back to the main trail. As I walked, I tried to focus on the trail, but it was getting harder to follow. The trees were so thick that I was starting to lose my sense of direction. I looked at my watch, 2 o'clock. I had been on the trail for over 4 hours now, and I was no closer to the summit. I should have turned around when I first felt uneasy. The trail started to narrow even more, and I had to climb over fallen logs and push through thick patches of underbrush. My legs were burning, and my breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. The adrenaline was making everything feel more intense. Every noise was amplified. Every shadow seemed darker. And then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I spun around again, my heart racing, but there was nothing. The trees were empty. My eyes darted over every inch of the forest, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No animals, no hikers, nothing. The trail was completely silent now. I tried to calm myself. It was just my imagination, I told myself. But as I stood there, listening. I felt the unmistakable sensation that someone was watching me. I had to get out of there. I turned back to the trail and started moving faster, my panic growing. The sound of footsteps came again, this time even closer, and I broke into a run, stumbling over roots and rocks, pushing myself harder than I ever had. The forest seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. I didn't stop running until I could see the clearing up ahead. The trees began to thin out, and I could see the sky again. The light was fading, but I didn't care. I pushed through the last stretch of the forest, finally breaking into the clearing where the main trail was. I stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt cooler now, and the silence of the forest was finally broken by the sounds of distant traffic and the faint hum of civilization. I was back. I had made it. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, my legs sore, my mind racing. I didn't care what had happened back there in the woods or who or what was following me. I had survived. I had made it out. By the time I reached my car, the sun was starting to set. The feeling of relief washed over me as I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I drove home in silence, no longer worried about the strange noises or the feeling of being watched. The hike was over, and I had learned my lesson. Some trails are better left unexplored, and some forests are better left alone. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle solitude. Growing up, I spent a lot of time in the woods, either alone or with friends, just walking through the trails, letting the sounds of nature wash over me. But that day, something felt different. Something about the woods was heavier, darker. I wasn't sure whether it was just my nerves getting the best of me, or if something truly was wrong. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It had started as a routine hike, just me and my backpack, a map, and the comforting weight of my boots crunching on the dirt path. The sun was high, and the weather was perfect. Clear skies, warm enough to make you forget about the cold nights that would come later. I had picked this trail because I had hiked it several times before, and I was familiar with it. It wasn't too difficult, a few inclines here and there, but overall a relaxing walk that I could do in a few hours. No big deal. I started out around noon. The first few miles were uneventful, just the usual sights and sounds of the forest. Birds flitting through the trees, squirrels chattering in the distance, and the constant rustle of leaves in the wind. But as I moved further into the woods, things started to change. The trail became narrower, and the trees grew thicker around me. There was a peculiar silence now. No more birds, no more animal noises. Just the wind brushing through the branches and the soft sound of my boots on the ground. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just the time of day or the shift in weather. But as I kept walking, I started to notice something else. The air was still unnaturally so. Couldn't even hear my breath. That's when I began to feel the pressure, like something was pushing down on me. The kind of pressure you feel when you know you're being watched, even if you can't see anyone. I looked around, but the woods seemed to stretch out endlessly in every direction. Nothing but trees and underbrush. Yet that feeling wouldn't go away. I kept walking, trying to push the anxiety out of my mind, but it was harder to ignore the further I went. The trail wound around a small hill, and when I crested the top, I came to a small clearing. There was a stream at the bottom, cutting through the forest, and some rocks scattered around. I stopped there to drink some water and catch my breath, hoping it would calm me down. As I knelt by the stream, something caught my eye. It was a small object lying on one of the rocks. I picked it up, and immediately my stomach dropped. It was a piece of fabric, torn and weathered, but definitely not something you'd find in the wilderness. It was a sleeve, part of a jacket or coat, but it wasn't any kind of material I recognized. The edges were frayed, and the color had faded with time, but it was clearly human-made. My first thought was that someone must have lost it, but the more I looked at it, the more unsettling it felt. I didn't know why, but the silence around me seemed even deeper now. The woods felt like they were closing in. I stood up and looked around, trying to figure out where the trail continued, but for some reason, it seemed harder to spot. The trees were so dense, and the underbrush thicker than I remembered. I had hiked this trail several times, and I was sure it hadn't been like this before. A sudden gust of wind shook the trees, making the air feel colder, and I shivered. It was time to leave the clearing. I dropped the piece of fabric and began walking again, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But the path ahead didn't feel familiar. The trail had twisted around a bit, but now it seemed as if it was leading me deeper into the woods, into unfamiliar territory. The branches above seemed to block out the sun, casting shadows that made the world feel even darker. I tried to push the feeling away, but my footsteps quickened. I glanced at my watch. It had only been about 2 hours since I started, but something told me I was way off the trail. The more I walked, the more disoriented I felt. The path didn't match the one I had hiked so many times before. I knew I hadn't veered off, so why did everything seem wrong? The woods were dense now, and there was no sign of any other hikers. It had been silent for so long that I started to feel the weight of the quiet pressing in on me. Every snap of a twig beneath my feet felt like an intrusion into an otherwise perfect stillness. I pulled out the map, trying to orient myself, but something strange happened when I looked at it. The markings didn't line up with what I was seeing around me. The map showed the trail winding gently through the forest, but the ground before me was uneven and jagged. I turned the map this way and that, trying to make sense of it, but nothing seemed to match. It was like the forest had changed while I wasn't paying attention. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a crack, deep in the trees, like something large moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, straining my ears. It was too far away to be another hiker, and it sounded much heavier, like a large animal. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. The noise stopped. I stood there for a few moments, listening, but all I could hear was the rushing of my own pulse in my ears. I forced myself to keep moving, my feet carrying me down the increasingly treacherous path. The air had turned damp, the smell of moss and earth strong in my nose. My thoughts were scattered now. The farther I went, the less sure I was of where I was. The woods felt wrong, not in any supernatural way, but just different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a wrong turn somewhere, but there was no way to know where. After what felt like an eternity of walking, I came to a break in the trees. Ahead of me, the forest opened up to a wide, rocky slope. I could see the edge of a cliff in the distance, the forest below looking like a patchwork quilt of green. The sight should have been a relief, but instead, I felt a sense of dread, as if the very landscape was a warning. I hadn't planned to come this far out. This was no longer part of the trail I knew. I stood there for a long moment, catching my breath and trying to calm my racing heart. The wind had picked up again, this time more forcefully. I thought about turning back, but the idea of retracing my steps in this unfamiliar territory was terrifying. I had to keep going forward. At least then, I might find some sign of the trail again. The rock was slick underfoot, and the path became steeper as I climbed. I didn't know why I was climbing, why I couldn't just turn around and go back. It felt like something was pushing me forward. Maybe I was just tired and disoriented, but my instincts were screaming at me now, telling me to get out of the woods. I reached the top of the slope, and the view opened up even wider. There, standing against the horizon, was a structure, a small cabin, tucked away among the trees. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had no memory of seeing it before, yet there it was, as if it had been waiting for me. I didn't approach it immediately. Something about it was off, like it didn't belong in the forest. But my curiosity got the better of me. I made my way down the slope toward the cabin, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I got closer, I noticed that the cabin was old, very old. The wood was weathered, and parts of the roof had caved in. Yet, the structure was standing strong, as though it had been built to withstand the harshest storms. The door was ajar. The wind had blown it open, and I could see inside. It was empty, dark, but I still hesitated. There was something about it that made my skin crawl. I couldn't explain why, but I stepped inside. The air was musty and thick, the smell of damp wood and decay surrounding me. The floor creaked beneath my weight, but I didn't care. I was already too far in. I needed to know more. Then I saw it. In the corner, on the floor, there was another piece of fabric. But this time, it wasn't just a sleeve. It was part of a shirt, torn and blood-stained. I turned and ran. It wasn't supposed to be this way. The whole reason I chose this trail was for the solitude. I'd done a lot of solo hiking before, but this time, I had been seeking something different. Something quiet, peaceful. I had read a lot about the trail, its views, the isolation. The guidebook claimed it was a hidden gem, one of those rare places where people didn't visit often. That's exactly what I wanted. I parked at the trailhead early in the morning, the air crisp and fresh. There was a slight chill still hanging in the air, but I knew it would warm up as the sun climbed higher. I'd packed light, only what I'd need for a one-day hike. Water, some snacks, a jacket, and a map. I always carried a map, even though I'd studied the trail and the surrounding area well. The trail started off easy, a well-marked path winding through dense trees. The forest smelled fresh, earthy, with that distinct pine scent. It was all so quiet. I could hear the rustling of the leaves as a light breeze brushed through the canopy. The ground was soft beneath my boots, covered in a carpet of dried leaves and pine needles. I walked at a steady pace, not in a rush. The trail was mostly downhill at first, leading me toward a small creek that I knew I'd have to cross. Nothing unusual yet. Everything seemed fine. The sun broke through the trees in rays, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, their calls echoing off the trees. As I continued down the trail, I noticed that the usual sounds of the forest began to fade. The chirping birds grew quieter, the rustling leaves stilled. It wasn't exactly silent, but the usual hum of nature was absent. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt off. Still, I didn't give it much thought. After all, I was out here for solitude. Maybe it was just the isolated nature of the trail. The creek was just as I remembered from the maps. It wasn't wide, just a shallow stream of water cutting through the forest, with moss-covered rocks making an easy crossing. I took my time, carefully stepping from rock to rock, the water flowing gently around my boots. As I made it across, I paused for a moment to admire the view. It was a peaceful spot, perfect place to rest, but I had miles to go, so I pressed on. The trail began to steepen, climbing up a slight incline. The trees thickened here, and the trail became less defined. It was more of a rough path, one that had seen less traffic. The air felt heavier now, the quiet more pronounced. There was no sound of animals, no birds, no squirrels darting through the trees. Just the crunch of my boots on the earth, the occasional rustle of a branch swaying in the breeze. I stopped for a second, thinking I heard something, a snap like a branch breaking. But when I turned around, there was nothing. I shook my head, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The sound could have been anything, a falling tree branch, maybe. It wasn't anything to be concerned about, right? I continued upward, feeling the weight of the air pushing in on me. The trees were taller now, their trunks thick with age, and their branches blocked out much of the sunlight. I could still see the trail, but it was becoming more obscured by thick underbrush and overgrown plants. I had to keep my eyes sharp to stay on track, not wanting to lose the trail. The feeling of being watched came over me again, stronger this time. I paused and scanned the area, but all I could see were trees and the faint hint of the path winding ahead. There was no one, no sign of life beyond the plants and trees. No footsteps behind me. It was just my own, echoing in the silence. The trail began to narrow as it climbed higher into the hills. The trees started to give way to patches of open rock, the kind of terrain where you had to watch your step. I paused for a moment, pulling out my water bottle and taking a sip. The quiet was almost unnerving, too still for my liking. I couldn't explain it, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. As I continued up the incline, I noticed the air was growing colder. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and shadows were stretching longer across the ground. I had expected to reach the summit by late afternoon, but now I was starting to realize that time had gotten away from me. I still had a long way to go. It was then that I heard it again. A snap. This time it was much closer. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place. I turned around, looking for anything that might explain the sound. The forest was still empty, just the quiet trees and the faint rustling of leaves. But something felt different now. Something had changed. I took a few more steps forward, trying to shake off the feeling, but it only intensified. I glanced around nervously, feeling the weight of the silence bearing down on me. It was so thick, so suffocating. Then there was another snap, closer this time. I could have sworn I heard the crunch of leaves, as though something was moving through the brush just out of sight. My heart began to race. I had hiked these kinds of trails before. I knew the risks. Wild animals, sure. Bears, coyotes, mountain lions, all of them were possible. But this felt wrong. I wasn't just hearing sounds. I was feeling something. The forest felt alive in a way that wasn't comforting. I picked up my pace, the trail now a steep, rocky climb that made it harder to keep my footing. The rocks were loose in places, and I had to be careful not to slip. Each time I stepped, I could hear another snap, a crack, just out of sight. It was getting to the point where I couldn't tell if it was in my head or if something or someone was really following me. The path leveled out for a moment, and I finally reached a small clearing. It wasn't much of a clearing, but it offered a moment of respite. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, my eyes darting from tree to tree, scanning the area for any sign of movement. There was nothing at all. I was being paranoid, I told myself. I needed to focus, just get to the summit and then head back. But as I started walking again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was wrong. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but it was a gnawing feeling deep in my gut. The trail continued to narrow as I made my way back into the trees. The temperature dropped even further, and the sun was starting to set behind the hills. The quiet had become unbearable, and the deep sense of unease refused to leave. The rocks underfoot felt heavier now, more unstable, as if the ground itself was trying to shake me off. Then I saw it, a flash of movement to my left, a figure just beyond the trees. I froze. My pulse raced. My first instinct was to turn and run, but something held me in place. I squinted, trying to make out what I'd seen. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything I recognized, but it was something watching me from the shadows. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way I had imagined it. Something was out there, but what? Who? I turned around and started heading back down the trail, my legs trembling. I had no idea if I was being followed or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The hike down was faster, the daylight quickly fading. The sounds of the forest were beginning to return, but they felt different, as though everything had become more distant, more dangerous. I quickened my pace, feeling the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I just needed to get back to the trailhead. By the time I reached the clearing near the creek, the sky had darkened completely. I could see the faint outline of the trailhead through the trees, the faint glow of my car's headlights barely visible through the underbrush. I didn't stop to rest, didn't look back. I just kept moving. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors behind me and took a deep breath. I hadn't seen anything concrete. There were no signs of anyone else on the trail. But I knew what I'd felt, what I'd heard. It wasn't normal. I left the parking lot without a second thought. The hum of my engine, the only sound breaking the silence of the night. The feeling of being watched stayed with me for the entire drive back. A reminder that sometimes it's better to listen to the uneasy feeling in your gut. I had always loved hiking. There was something about the solitude, the sounds of nature, and the simple joy of putting one foot in front of the other that felt grounding. But that day, something felt different. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was just the creeping thought that I had pushed myself too far this time. I wasn't sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It started off as a routine hike. I'd been here before, this quiet, forested trail that wound up through the mountains to a lookout spot where you could see the whole valley below. It was a peaceful trail, not too strenuous but still enough to make you feel accomplished at the top. I had been hiking solo more often lately. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy company, but sometimes I found peace in the quiet of being alone with my thoughts. The sky was overcast when I began the hike. Not too unusual for this time of year. The clouds hung heavy, almost like they were waiting for something to happen. The air was cool but not cold, a slight breeze rustling the leaves. There was a slight smell of rain in the air, but nothing that indicated a storm was imminent. I was used to the unpredictable nature of the weather here. Mountain weather, after all, could change on a dime. The first few miles of the trail were familiar, easy even. I knew the twists and turns, the slight inclines, and the streams that crossed the path. Everything felt fine. Too fine, maybe. There's a certain rhythm that comes with being alone in nature. You start to get into a mental groove where everything just flows, your steps, your breath, your thoughts. But that day, as I walked, something kept pulling my attention. A crackling sound that I couldn't pinpoint. The rustling of leaves, maybe. The occasional snap of a twig, perhaps. But there was something off about it. Something that felt wrong. I shook it off at first. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. But as I climbed higher, the sounds started to grow more frequent. There was a distinct crunch of leaves, the kind you hear when someone steps on a dry patch. I stopped for a moment, scanning the woods around me. Nothing, no movement. It was then that I noticed the silence. The normal hum of the forest, the distant calls of birds, the rustling of small animals in the brush, had all stopped. It was like the entire forest had held its breath. I couldn't explain it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I started walking faster, trying to push the thought out of my head. Maybe I was just being dramatic. I was alone and it was getting late. My mind was probably playing tricks on me, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The trail became steeper as I continued upwards, and I could feel the fatigue setting in. I should have turned back, but I told myself I was close to the top. I had come this far, and there was no harm in continuing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Figure, just a blur, darting behind a tree. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, staring at the spot where I had seen it. It was too fast to make out clearly, but there was no mistaking what I had seen. Someone was out here with me. The realization hit me hard, and a surge of panic washed over me. The trail wasn't busy. It was rare to encounter anyone on it, especially this time of day. Whoever it was, they were close. Too close. I took a step back, my mind racing. Should I call out? Should I keep going? I decided to keep walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The pace of my steps quickened, my breath growing shallow. I told myself to stay calm. There were plenty of hikers on the trails in this area. It could have just been someone out for a walk, but why hadn't I seen them earlier? And why was I suddenly so aware of every little sound, every little movement? The trees around me were getting denser, and the path was narrowing. I was nearing the halfway point of the trail, where the trees gave way to more open ground. A small clearing awaited, where you could take a break and look out over the valley below. But as I reached the edge of the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a pile of rocks. Nothing too unusual about that. Rocks are common in these parts, but this pile was different. It wasn't just a random scattering of stones. It had been carefully arranged in a perfect circle. There was no mistaking it. It looked like some kind of marker. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise again. There was a weird energy about the place. It was like the air had thickened, the atmosphere had changed. I didn't know how to explain it, but it felt wrong. I wanted to leave. I wanted to turn around and run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. My brain screamed at me to get out, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I took a few steps closer to the rock pile, my curiosity getting the better of me. As I neared, I noticed something odd. In the center of the circle of rocks, there was a small, weathered wooden figure. It was crudely carved, maybe a foot tall, with strange markings on its surface. It didn't look like anything I had ever seen before. I couldn't say why, but it made my stomach twist. Something about it felt wrong. I should have walked away then, but I didn't. I reached down and touched it. The moment my fingers brushed against the figure, a sharp crack echoed through the air. It was like the sound of a twig snapping, but louder, more intense. My heart raced, and I jumped back, my breath catching in my throat. I turned around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, no one. The woods were silent again, but this time, the silence felt suffocating. I didn't care anymore what was happening or why. I turned and ran. I didn't know how long I had been running. My legs burned, my chest heaved, but I couldn't stop. The fear was a living, breathing thing in my chest, and it pushed me forward. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was going on, but it was like the trail itself was playing tricks on me. Every turn felt wrong, like I wasn't on the same path anymore. I was getting deeper into the woods, not out of them. But then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it, the trailhead, the familiar sign, the parking lot in the distance. Relief flooded through me, and I nearly collapsed. I had made it back. As I reached the car, I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. But as I sat in the driver's seat, trying to calm my breathing, something in the back of my mind kept nagging at me. The figure, the rocks, the strange feeling, it didn't add up. I started the engine and drove away, but I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The road felt endless, even though I knew it wasn't far. The woods behind me looked the same, but somehow different, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. It wasn't until I got home, safe and sound, that I started to process what had happened. I Googled the trail, the markings, the figures, but there was nothing. No record of any strange occurrences, no reports of hikers going missing. It was as if the place didn't exist in any official capacity. But I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't forget it. That night, I slept soundly, but the next day, when I looked out the window at the forest beyond my backyard, I couldn't help but feel like the woods were watching me back. I had always been the adventurous type, the kind of person who loves hiking and exploring trails, especially when they were off the beaten path. There's something about being alone in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees and the distant sounds of wildlife, that makes you feel alive. That day, I decided to hike a trail I hadn't done before. It wasn't on any official maps or in any guidebooks, but I had heard about it from a few locals during a recent trip to the area. They mentioned it with a sense of mystery, almost like it was a secret. I was in the mountains, a place where the air felt thick and cool even in the summer. The sun was already starting to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows over the trail. I'd been walking for hours, the only sound being the crunch of gravel under my boots and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. My pack, with water, a few snacks, and my emergency supplies, weighed down on my back, but it wasn't anything I couldn't handle. The trail was rugged, overgrown in parts, with wild vines and shrubs blocking the path. I had to push my way through some of the thicker brush, trying not to trip over the roots of trees or lose my footing on the uneven ground. At times, I'd stop and listen, letting the silence soak in. The forest was eerily quiet, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Around midday, I reached a clearing. It wasn't much, a few patches of grass and a couple of large boulders, but it gave me a chance to rest and take a drink of water. I pulled out my map, double-checking where I was. The trail seemed to fork here, one path leading off into thicker trees, and the other continuing down a steep slope. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should turn back, but I'd come so far, and the idea of turning around didn't sit right with me. I chose the path into the trees, reasoning that it could lead to something interesting. As I ventured deeper, the trail grew steeper, the vegetation denser. I had to duck under low-hanging branches and step carefully over fallen logs. The air seemed to grow cooler, the trees closer together, blocking out much of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the less I could hear. It was like the forest was swallowing up the sound, leaving only a soft rustling of leaves in the wind. I didn't notice the change at first, but something felt off. It was like the air had thickened, or maybe it was just the weight of the silence pressing in. I kept walking, telling myself it was just my imagination, but it didn't go away. A few miles into the trail, I came across something that made me stop. A set of footprints. They were fresh, too fresh to have been made by anyone other than a hiker in the last day or so. The print was a boot with a deep indentation, as though whoever had made it had been carrying a heavy load. There was something unsettling about the way the tracks seemed to lead off the trail toward a small creek that ran nearby. I stood there for a long time trying to decide whether I should follow the tracks or keep going. The fact that they led off the trail made me uneasy. I couldn't help but wonder why someone would leave the main path. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow them. The creek was shallow, and the rocks that lined its edges were slick from the moisture. The tracks led straight to the water's edge, and then they just stopped. There was no sign of whoever had made them, no indication of where they went or if they'd continued on further. I knelt down, touching the ground near the prints, trying to piece together what had happened. Had they turned around, or had something else happened? A small chill ran down my spine. I stood up quickly, feeling a sudden sense of urgency. The forest had grown darker, and the breeze had picked up, causing the branches to sway overhead. The trail I had been following now seemed to close in on me, as if it was narrowing with each step. I turned to head back to the main path, but then I heard it. A noise, a twig snapping. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. My heart started to race, and I immediately stopped walking, listening. The wind had died down again, and the silence returned, thick and suffocating. I strained my ears, trying to locate the sound. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. I took a deep breath and started walking faster, back toward the trail. My thoughts raced. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that it could just be another hiker, someone else on the same trail. But something told me it wasn't. The steps were too deliberate, too slow, as though whoever it was following me, keeping pace without making any noise. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, trying to stay calm. The thought of turning around to confront whoever was back there crossed my mind, but I quickly dismissed it. I wasn't prepared for a confrontation. I had no weapons, no way to defend myself if things went wrong. All I had were my wits, and right now that didn't seem like much. I reached the fork in the trail again, this time opting for the steep slope, hoping it would be harder to follow. My legs burned as I descended, but I didn't slow down. The air was getting colder, the light dimmer as the sun sank lower in the sky. The trail was barely visible now, just a narrow strip between trees and rocks. I didn't hear the footsteps anymore, but that didn't mean they weren't there. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing. I forced myself to keep moving, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching me. The slope leveled out after a while, and I stumbled into another clearing. This one was bigger, with a small cabin in the center. It looked abandoned, the windows covered in grime, the door slightly ajar. My first instinct was to turn back, to leave the area immediately. But then I saw movement in the trees beyond the cabin. A figure standing motionless, watching. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if it was waiting for something. I didn't wait to find out what. I turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail was harder to follow now, the darkness thickening around me. But I couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. I ran for what felt like hours, my legs aching, my lungs burning. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing, but the fear didn't let up, clung to me, suffocating me, driving me forward. I had to get out. I had to get back to the safety of the town, to where people were, where I wasn't alone in the woods with whatever was stalking me. Eventually, the forest started to thin out. I could hear the distant sounds of the highway, the hum of traffic. I slowed down, my breath ragged, and walked the rest of the way to the road. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, I felt like I was about to collapse. I never did find out who or what was out there in the woods with me that day. But I do know one thing for certain. Some trails are better left unexplored. Some mysteries should stay that way, and some places should remain just as they are, hidden, forgotten, and undisturbed. As I walked back to town, I promised myself I would never venture off the path again. The mountains had given me a glimpse into something darker, something I wasn't meant to understand. And for once, I was content to leave it at that. I decided to do the Ridge Trail in late September. It was a long, steep loop in northern Montana that crossed over several ridgelines and dipped in and out of the forest. I had the time off from work and wanted to clear my head. I'd done solo hikes before, some even longer than this one, and I felt comfortable being out there by myself. I had my gear packed: tent, sleeping bag, stove, dry food, water filter, first aid kit, bear spray, GPS, and an old map with all the topography marked. I also had my phone, but I didn't expect service out there. I drove up early in the morning, parked in the gravel lot where the trail had started, and locked up the car. There were no other vehicles around, and I liked that. I enjoyed the silence, the crisp air, and the way the forest always felt like it held its breath when someone new stepped into it. The trail started gently, winding through tall fir trees and crossing a few creeks. The first few miles were easy. I could hear the water flowing and birds chirping high up in the canopy. The trail was dry and well used, with clear blazes on the trees. Every hour or so, I checked the GPS to make sure I was following the route I'd planned. By the afternoon, I was about 10 miles in and climbing steadily. I stopped for lunch near a flat rock that overlooked the trees below. I could see for miles in every direction, layers of hills and valleys, the peaks of distant mountains, some still dusted with snow. I felt good. Tired, but that good kind of tired where your body is working like it's supposed to. Around 4 p.m., I started looking for a place to make camp. I found a small clearing near a slope just off the trail. It was flat, quiet, and had a few trees to shield the wind. I set up my tent, boiled some water, made a freeze-dried meal, and ate as the sun started dipping behind the trees. The temperature dropped fast after sunset. I crawled into my sleeping bag and zipped it tight, listening to the distant sounds of the woods settling in. Branches creaked. Something small rustled through the underbrush. Normal sounds. I slept pretty well that first night. The second day was harder. The trail climbed fast, and the switchbacks were steep and rocky. I passed through a patch of dead trees, probably from a fire years ago, and the ground was dry and cracked. There were bones out there, scattered near a patch of scrub, probably deer. The skull was clean, picked dry. I stopped and looked at it for a moment but moved on. I didn't like lingering in places like that. The wind picked up when I hit the ridgeline. I had to stop and brace myself a few times. On one side, the slope dropped sharply into a canyon. On the other side, the hill rolled down into thick trees. I kept checking my footing. The rocks were loose, and there wasn't much margin for error. I had trekking poles which helped with balance, but it was still slow going. I was careful and I wasn't in a rush. Around midday, the sky darkened a bit. Not clouds, just a haze, like dust or smoke. I didn't smell smoke, but it made me uneasy. The air felt still, too still, and even the wind seemed to die down. That's when I noticed the silence. No birds, no bugs, no wind through the trees. Just my own breathing and the crunch of my boots. I kept going. The next few miles were more of the same. Uphill climbs, scattered boulders, narrow trails on steep slopes. I passed an old wooden sign, half rotted and hanging off one nail. It said North Ridge Connector and pointed east. That part of the trail wasn't on my GPS or my printed map. It looked overgrown, almost unused. I made a note of it and kept on the main trail, heading south toward my intended loop. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. I found a flat spot near a small grove and set up my second camp. I didn't see any animals, not even deer tracks. The only signs of life were a few old droppings and some scratched bark on one of the trees. I didn't recognize the marks. They weren't bear claws, too shallow and too many of them. I told myself it was probably from porcupines or squirrels. That night was different. I was lying in my tent, staring at the nylon roof in the dark, when I heard movement outside. It wasn't like before. This was heavy, deliberate. A single set of footsteps crunching on leaves. Slow, steady. I stopped breathing for a second and listened. It circled the tent. The steps made a full loop around me. Then they stopped right near my head. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I gripped the bear spray and held my breath. After a few long seconds, the steps started again and moved off into the trees. I waited for a while before finally falling asleep. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a moose. In the morning, I checked around the tent. No tracks, nothing disturbed, just pine needles and dry leaves. I kept going. By the third day, I was 25 miles in. The trail dropped into a valley and then climbed sharply again. That's when things got worse. I took a wrong turn. I didn't notice it at first. The trail forked near a fallen tree, and the main path was partly covered in brush. I followed the clearer path, assuming it was right. After an hour of hiking, I realized I hadn't seen any blazes in a while. I pulled out the GPS. It couldn't find a signal. I tried my phone, no service. I backtracked and tried to retrace my steps, but everything started to look the same. That afternoon, I was officially lost. The ridge sloped down sharply, and I couldn't find the trail again. I tried going back to where I thought I'd camped the night before, but I couldn't even find the grove. I started to panic, but I kept moving. I knew if I kept heading generally south, I'd eventually cross a forest road or the main loop again. That's when I saw the first trap. It was hidden just off the trail. A crude snare, made from wire and tied between two trees. The loop was set low to the ground. It looked old, rusty, not something a hunter would leave in season. I stepped over it carefully and kept walking, but my gut started turning. I found more snares later, some newer, some just sticks sharpened and buried in the leaves pointing up. By now, I was completely off trail. I didn't want to go back uphill, so I followed the slope downward, hoping it would lead to a stream or a road. But the woods got denser, the underbrush thicker. I found more signs, bones again. This time not picked clean, just piles of them. Some looked fresh. A rib cage, a spine, a patch of bloodied fur still stuck to it. I moved faster. As the sun dropped low, I stumbled into a clearing and froze. There was a structure there. Not a cabin, not a shack, just a lean-to made from logs and bark. It looked abandoned, but there were fresh boot prints around it. A dead rabbit hung from a wire nailed into a tree. His throat had been slit. The meat was rotting. The flies were thick. I backed away. I didn't sleep that night. I moved through the woods by moonlight, sticking close to the ridgeline and trying to avoid making noise. I kept hearing things, cracks of branches, distant footfalls, breathing that wasn't mine. At dawn, I found the trail again. I almost cried when I saw the blaze on the tree. I knew if I followed it long enough, it would take me back to the trailhead. I moved fast, barely stopping to eat or drink. But I wasn't alone anymore. I kept catching glimpses, movement far off in the trees. A figure always just out of sight. I never got a good look, just shadows, quick and quiet. I didn't know if it was a man or something else, but it was following me, keeping pace. I found another trap near the trail. This one was newer, a fresh branch, bent and tied with cord, ready to snap. I cut it loose and kept going. My legs were shaking, but I didn't stop. On the 5th day, I made it back to the parking lot. My car was still there, untouched, but someone had tried to break into it. The door handle was scratched. The passenger window had a crack in it. I got in, locked the doors, and drove off without even changing my boots. I didn't report it to the rangers. I didn't even tell anyone about what happened. I just drove home, took a long shower, and sat on the floor for hours. That night, I dreamed of footsteps circling my bed. The next day, I threw away my tent. I didn't touch any of my gear again. It's been almost a year now, and I still don't know who or what was out there. Maybe someone living off-grid. Maybe a trapper, or something worse. I'll never know, but I know I'll never hike alone again. and I'll never go near the ridge trail. Not ever. Not after what I saw. It was supposed to be a peaceful hike, a weekend trip with no particular destination in mind. Just a simple way to break away from the usual routine of work and life. I didn't have much experience hiking, but I wasn't completely unfamiliar with the trails. I'd been out a few times before, always on well-marked paths that didn't venture too far off the beaten track. This time, though, I was going to try something different. The trailhead was at the edge of the forest, where the trees stood tall and tightly packed. The morning air was cool, and the sun had just begun to filter through the canopy above, casting long, dappled shadows on the ground. The forecast had been clear, promising perfect hiking weather. I'd packed light, some water, a snack, and a small first aid kit, just in case. I told myself I wouldn't go too far. Maybe just a couple of miles and back, no reason to push it. I started walking, the gravel crunching beneath my boots as I followed the winding trail. The trees around me were thick and their trunks seemed to stretch endlessly upwards. The further I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the city faded into the distance, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. I felt a sense of calm settle over me, and for a while I was content. But that peace didn't last long. After about half an hour, the trail started to narrow. The once wide path was now little more than a single track. I knew there were other hikers around, but there was no one else in sight. The air felt different here, more still, almost unnaturally so. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something felt off. The trees seemed to close in around me, their leaves blocking out much of the sun, casting everything in a dim, almost gloomy light. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe it was just the solitude, or maybe I was just getting into my own head. I kept walking, my boots moving steadily over the uneven ground. As I rounded a bend, the trail opened up for a moment, revealing a small clearing. The sun filtered through the branches overhead, casting long, stretching shadows across the grass. There was a fallen tree near the center, its trunk large and gnarled. It looked like the perfect spot to take a break, so I decided to sit for a moment. I pulled off my pack, took a long swig of water, and sat down on the log. The quiet was almost oppressive, and for a moment, I just listened to the sound of my own breathing, the occasional rustle of a leaf, and nothing else. No birds, no insects, just silence. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I stretched my legs out, trying to relax, but the feeling that something wasn't right didn't go away. It was hard to describe, just a creeping sense of discomfort, like I was being watched. I glanced around the clearing. Nothing. The trees stood as still and silent as ever. But then something caught my eye. At the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees, I saw a flash of movement, something pale and quick, darting between the trunks. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up, trying to catch another glimpse. It was gone. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature moving in the underbrush. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was nothing. I grabbed my pack and stood up, ready to move on. But before I took a step, I heard it. A low, almost imperceptible rustle, coming from the same direction where I'd seen the flash. My stomach twisted. I knew something wasn't right. With a deep breath, I told myself I was overthinking things, that I was just in my head. It was probably just an animal. I told myself that again and again as I took another step forward, but my mind kept circling back to that fleeting image I had seen. That strange feeling of being watched gnawed at me as I walked away from the clearing and back onto the narrow trail. I kept moving, trying to focus on the path ahead, but the air felt heavier with each step. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the trees more oppressive, the silence deeper. It was like the forest had become a different place entirely, like something had changed. I kept walking, though, hoping that the feeling would pass. Hours went by, or maybe it was just an hour. I had lost track of time. My legs ached, and my water was running low. The trail seemed to wind endlessly, with no sign of it getting any better. There were no other hikers, no signs of life. The path had become more uneven, more overgrown, and the trees taller, blocking out more of the light. I started to feel the isolation press down on me, the quiet now a weight rather than a comfort. And still, that feeling of being watched lingered, like something was out there, hidden just beyond the trees. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw nothing. Then, without warning, I stumbled. My foot caught on something, a root, a rock, I couldn't tell. I barely managed to catch myself, but my heart was racing. The sudden burst of adrenaline made me acutely aware of how alone I was. I paused, trying to collect myself, and that's when I heard it. A sharp, distinct sound. Something breaking through the underbrush, something large. Came from behind me, far off, but close enough that I could hear it clearly. I turned quickly, my eyes darting around the trees. But again, there was nothing. No animal, no figure, just trees and shadows. The noise stopped just as quickly as it had started, and once again, silence reigned. I didn't move for a moment, trying to calm my breathing. Then, against every instinct I had, I took a step forward. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I didn't want to be anywhere near those woods. But as I walked, that feeling, like I was being followed, intensified. My steps quickened, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept glancing over my shoulder, every little sound setting me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked faster, nearly jogging, until I came to a bend in the trail. Up ahead, I saw something strange. A pile of rocks, neatly stacked, as though someone had placed them deliberately in the middle of the trail. It wasn't much, but something about it struck me as odd. Who would do that? I approached cautiously, my eyes scanning the trees. There was something off about the scene. Too quiet, too still. I reached the rocks and, without thinking, kicked them aside. I shouldn't have, but I did. And then I saw it. A piece of fabric, half buried beneath the stones. It was a torn, weathered piece of cloth, part of a shirt or maybe a jacket. My blood ran cold. I crouched down, heart hammering, and pulled the fabric out. It was dirty, old, and stained with something that looked far too much like blood. I stood up quickly, feeling dizzy. My thoughts were racing, but I couldn't focus on anything. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of those woods. I turned back the way I came, my pace picking up again, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I didn't care about following the path. I just needed to get out. I ran. The branches scratched at my skin. The underbrush tangled around my feet, but I didn't stop. My legs were burning, but I kept going, my mind fixated on one thing: getting out of those woods. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I came to the edge of the forest. The trees started to thin out, and the trail opened up into a clearing. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the grass. I could see the parking lot in the distance. I stumbled toward it, my legs shaking with exhaustion. As I reached the edge of the woods, I paused, looking back one last time. The trees stood silent, unmoving. The path I had come from now just a shadow behind me. I felt the weight of the silence lift as I stepped out of the woods. I never went back to that trail. I went on a hiking trip last fall that I still think about almost every day. I had planned it for a while. I was tired of being stuck at home, tired of my routine, and I felt like I needed to get away from everything. I'm not someone who usually travels alone, but something in me said I needed space. I chose a national forest about 5 hours from where I live in Indiana. It wasn't a tourist-heavy area, which was exactly what I wanted. I was looking for something quiet, a place where I could hear myself think. The trail I picked wasn't popular. Most people stuck to the shorter loops that stayed near the visitor center, but I found a longer trail that cut deep into the forest and looped around the edge of a ridge. It was about 17 miles altogether, so I planned to do it over 2 days, camping overnight somewhere near the halfway point. I left early in the morning and made it to the trailhead just as the sun was coming up. The air was cool, and the leaves had started changing. The reds and oranges were just starting to come out, which made the forest look like it was on fire in the morning light. I packed light tent, sleeping bag, some food, a water filter, a basic first aid kit, and a map. I turned my phone off once I got there. I wanted to be present, to clear my head. The first part of the hike went smoothly. The trail was narrow but well-marked. I saw squirrels, a few deer in the distance, and lots of birds. There wasn't a single person out there. I felt like I had the whole forest to myself. The trail climbed steadily for the first few miles. I stopped around noon to eat and rest near a small stream. The sound of the water and the wind in the trees was peaceful. I started thinking maybe this was what I needed all along, to get away and reset. By mid-afternoon, I reached a higher point in the trail where the trees opened up. I could see the ridgeline I would be following the next day. The forest stretched out in every direction, just endless trees and hills. It was beautiful and kind of overwhelming. I set up camp before it got dark. I found a flat spot just off the trail, not too close to the edge but still high up. I cooked a quick dinner and ate while watching the sun set through the trees. It got cold quickly after dark. I zipped up in my sleeping bag and lay there listening to the forest settle down. That night, I had trouble sleeping. It wasn't that I was scared. I'd camped before, and the noises of the woods never bothered me. But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was like the silence between the sounds was too deep. I kept waking up, not from a noise, but from a lack of one. Like something should have made a sound and didn't. Around 3 a.m., I finally fell into a deeper sleep. The next morning, I packed up and got moving early. I wanted to finish the rest of the trail by afternoon. That section was steeper and more remote. The trail hugged the edge of the ridge. On one side, the ground dropped off sharply into thick woods. The path got narrow in places with rocks and tree roots to navigate. I kept moving even though I felt tired. I kept telling myself I'd feel better once I got back to the car. Around mid-morning, I noticed something strange. The trail didn't look the way it had on the map. I should have passed a fork leading down toward a creek, but I didn't see one. I pulled out my map and looked around. The terrain didn't match what I expected. I thought maybe I had missed a turn, so I backtracked. After a while, I realized I didn't recognize anything. The trail had faded and it felt more like a game trail. It didn't make sense. I had stayed on the marked trail the whole time. I kept trying to reorient myself, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all looked the same. I walked for another hour, hoping I'd cross the trail again. My water was running low, and I hadn't passed any streams. The ground got rockier, and the trees grew closer together. It felt like the forest was pressing in. My chest got tight, and I started sweating even though it was cool. Then I tripped over something and went down hard. My ankle twisted under me, and I landed on my side. I sat there for a minute trying to breathe. The pain in my ankle shot up my leg. I knew right away it was bad. I tried to stand and almost fell again. I couldn't put any weight on it. My pack had landed a few feet away. I crawled over to it and took out the first aid kit. I wrapped my ankle the best I could, then sat there trying to think. There was no cell service. I hadn't seen another person since I started. I was somewhere off-trail in a part of the forest that wasn't well-traveled. I had a map, but I didn't know exactly where I was anymore. I ate a granola bar and drank the last of my water. Then I pulled out the emergency whistle I kept clipped to my pack and started blowing it in bursts. The sound echoed a bit but didn't travel far. I sat like that for hours, calling out with the whistle, resting, then trying again. The sun moved across the sky. I couldn't tell how far I had come from the ridge, but I knew I was deep in the woods. My ankle swelled more as the hours passed. I finally dragged myself under a tree and tried to stay calm. That night was worse than the first. The pain in my leg kept me awake. I heard animals moving nearby, and every sound made my heart race. I didn't sleep at all. I kept thinking someone would find me. I kept telling myself just to hang on until morning. The next day, I tried crawling in the direction I thought the trail was. It was slow, painful. I tore my hands on rocks and branches. My clothes were soaked with sweat and dirt. Every few minutes I had to stop and rest. I rationed the last bit of food I had. The sky turned gray around noon, and a cold wind picked up. By late afternoon, I started to panic. I had gone too far in the wrong direction. There was no sign of a trail, no sound of people, nothing. Just woods and rocks and silence. I started yelling again, even though I knew it was pointless. My voice cracked from thirst. I was getting lightheaded. I started seeing shapes in the trees that weren't there. I knew I was getting close to the edge. I thought about my family. I thought about how stupid it was to come out here alone. That night, it rained. I curled up under a thick tree and pulled my coat tight around me. I shook from the cold. My ankle throbbed. I kept thinking about sleep, but was afraid if I did, I wouldn't wake up. I held onto my whistle and blew it every so often, even though I could barely lift my arm. Sometime around dawn, I heard something different. A mechanical noise, faint but real. I forced myself to sit up. It was a helicopter. I waved my arms and blew the whistle over and over. I couldn't see it through the trees, but the sound got louder. Then it faded. I almost started crying. I thought I missed my chance. But an hour later, I heard voices. Real voices, not imagined ones. I tried yelling, but my throat was too dry. I blew the whistle again and again. Then I saw two people in bright jackets coming through the trees. One of them shouted and ran over. They found me. I don't remember much after that. They gave me water, checked my leg, and called in a rescue crew. I got flown out in a helicopter later that afternoon. They told me I had wandered almost 4 miles off the trail. I had been out there for 3 days. If it had rained harder or gotten colder, they said it could have ended differently. My ankle took weeks to heal. I still have trouble walking long distances. I think about that trip more than I should. It wasn't just about getting lost. It was about being truly alone, about realizing how small you are in a place like that. I didn't see anything supernatural or magical. It was just nature, indifferent and unforgiving. But I came out of it alive. I learned to respect the wilderness more than ever, and I haven't gone hiking alone since. I've always been an avid hiker, someone who enjoys the quiet of nature, the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. It's always been a way for me to disconnect, to clear my head, and just be. This trip was supposed to be no different. I had planned it for weeks, looking over trail maps, studying weather reports, and making sure I had all the right gear. I didn't expect anything to go wrong. But then again, I never do. I set out early in the morning, just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The air was still cool, but the promise of a warm day was already beginning to make itself known. I was hiking a trail that was known to be relatively easy, a popular path in a forest not too far from the town I lived in. I'd hiked it before, a few times actually, but this time I was going to take a detour and explore a less traveled offshoot that I'd noticed on the map. It was something I'd never done before, but it seemed like the perfect opportunity to get away from the crowds. The first few miles were familiar, comforting even. The trees towered above me, casting long shadows on the ground. Birds chirped in the distance, and the only other sounds were the steady rhythm of my boots on the dirt path. It was peaceful. I'd been walking for a couple of hours, taking occasional breaks to drink water and snap a few photos of the scenery. The detour was supposed to be just around the corner, but as I walked on, the path began to feel different. It wasn't that the terrain had changed much. The trees were still dense, the underbrush thick. It was the silence. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, insects buzzing had faded. The only sound was my breath and the crunch of the trail beneath my feet. I wasn't sure why, but something about that unnerving quiet set off a warning bell in my mind. I brushed it off as nothing. After all, I'd hiked alone many times before. The quiet was part of the experience. It's why I went out here in the first place. But as I veered off the main trail, the unsettling feeling only grew stronger. The path was overgrown, with thorny bushes brushing against my legs. I had to push my way through the brush in some places, leaving scratch marks on my arms and legs. It wasn't like I hadn't done this before. I was used to rugged terrain. Still, it felt like I was being watched. I stopped for a second, scanning the area around me. I couldn't shake the feeling. The air had grown still, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it, reminding myself that I was just being paranoid. The feeling only deepened as I pressed on, and after a while, I found myself checking over my shoulder more often. I chalked it up to being in unfamiliar territory, but the weight of the sensation never left me. I kept moving forward, telling myself I was just being ridiculous. The trail became narrower and more difficult to follow, but I pressed on. Then I came across something odd. It wasn't anything big, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. There, just off to the side of the path, was a small, oddly shaped pile of rocks. It wasn't a cairn, those were meant to mark trails, but it was definitely intentional. Whoever had placed them there had arranged them in a way that seemed too deliberate to be natural. I hesitated, a strange unease crawling up my spine. I walked closer to the pile, inspecting it for any signs of what it could mean. There were no signs, no markings, no symbols, just the rocks. It was like someone had left a message, but there was no way of knowing what that message was. I felt my heart rate pick up as I backed away from the pile, looking around me again. The forest felt darker, the shadows stretching longer despite the early hour. I had come to a decision. I wasn't going any further. It wasn't that I was scared. I wasn't, but the feeling of being watched had grown so strong, so suffocating, that I didn't want to take any chances. I turned around, ready to head back to the main trail, when I heard something. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. A slow, steady crunch of leaves underfoot. My heart skipped. It wasn't the wind. I stood perfectly still, straining my ears. The sound was getting closer. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I could identify. The steps were too heavy, too calculated. Whoever or whatever it wasn't trying to hide its presence. I didn't wait around to find out. My instincts kicked in, and I started to move faster, cutting back through the brush in the direction I came. I could hear the crunching behind me, closer now, almost as if it were pacing me. I pushed through the branches, the thorns scraping at my arms, the underbrush tangling around my legs. I could feel my breath quickening, but I didn't stop. The sound was still there, right behind me, close enough that I could almost feel it breathing down my neck. I reached the main trail in what felt like record time, but the noise didn't stop. It was still there, trailing behind me as I walked faster, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear anything that would explain the sound, but I knew it was there. My eyes were darting everywhere, trying to spot any movement. There was nothing, only the forest, only the path, only me. When I finally reached the area where the trail split, I took a deep breath and looked around once more. The feeling of being watched had lifted. The unsettling presence was gone. But I couldn't shake the thought that someone, had been following me, and I wasn't sure if I had gotten away. As I made my way back to the parking lot, I still couldn't shake the feeling. I kept looking over my shoulder, as though expecting someone to jump out from behind a tree. But nothing happened. I reached my car, threw my pack in the back seat, and locked the door quickly. It wasn't until I started the engine that I realized my hands were trembling. I had made it out, safe but shaken. The whole hike, from the eerie quiet to the strange sounds, was something I wouldn't forget. But despite the unease, despite the feeling that something was off, I was glad I'd pushed through. I had taken that detour. I had explored the unknown, and I had come back stronger for it. The forest may have felt like it was hiding something, but I was leaving with the one thing that mattered most, my own safety, and that was enough for me. I took a week off work after months of stress building up. I needed to get out, away from the screens, the deadlines, the constant buzzing of phones and emails. My head had started to feel too crowded. I live in southern Ohio, and there's no shortage of trails and forests around here. I found a hiking loop about 3 hours east, deep in the Wayne National Forest. It wasn't popular, at least not the route I planned. It was a 23-mile loop through remote parts of the woods, something not many people attempted solo, especially in early spring when nights could still dip below freezing. That was part of the appeal. Solitude. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, a good amount of food, 2 lighters, backup matches, knife, map, compass, GPS watch, solar charger, first aid kit. I even brought my emergency blanket and flare. I wasn't careless. I had done solo hikes before, though not quite this remote. I left early in the morning, drove through winding country roads, passed by small towns that looked like they'd been built in the 60s and forgotten. The road into the forest became gravel, then dirt. I parked my car at a small clearing used as an unofficial trailhead. There were no signs, just a wooden post with a weathered map behind cracked plastic. The air was cold when I stepped out. Everything smelled damp. Wet earth, moss, leaves that hadn't fully broken down from the fall. I shouldered my pack, locked the car, and began. The trail started off fine. Clear enough, with tree markers spaced close enough that I never had to guess where I was. The sound of the road faded quickly, and soon I was surrounded by the creaking of trees, the chirps of birds, the rustle of squirrels darting through underbrush. The deeper I got, the less I heard. Around mile 5, I hadn't seen another soul. No boot prints, no broken twigs that looked fresh. Nothing. That first day was uneventful. The trail sloped up and down but wasn't brutal. I kept a good pace and made camp in a small clearing just off the trail around dusk. I set up the tent, boiled some ramen, and laid in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest. There were distant hoots of owls, the occasional crack of a branch under some animal's weight. I slept fine. The next day, around mile 10, the trail narrowed. Trees leaned inward, and visibility shrank. It had rained the day before, and the soil was soft. That's when I noticed something. Boot prints. Not mine. These were larger, deeper. Someone had passed through here ahead of me. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe another hiker. Maybe a hunter. But as I kept going, I noticed that the prints occasionally veered off the trail. They'd disappear into the brush and then reappear 100 yards later. Always the same size, same tread pattern. Deep too. Whoever it was, they were heavy or carrying something. Around mile 12, I hit a section that had clearly suffered storm damage. Fallen trees blocked the path, and I had to climb over some of them or detour around. I noticed the prints again in the mud beside a downed log, but something made me pause. The print faced the log directly, but there was no follow-up print on the other side. It was like the person stood there and turned around. I shook it off. Maybe they had stepped over to a dry patch. I didn't find more prints right away, so I kept walking. I started feeling watched around mid-afternoon. I kept catching shapes in the corner of my eye, movement behind the trees. Every time I turned, there was nothing. I wrote it off as nerves. I was alone in the woods, miles from anyone. It was natural to feel uneasy. I made camp again near a small stream. I filtered water, ate a granola bar, and turned in early. That night, though, I woke up twice. First time was to what sounded like footsteps near the tent. Not animal scurrying, slow, deliberate steps. I sat up, grabbed my knife, and held my breath. The steps stopped. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek outside. Moonlight lit up the clearing, and I saw nothing. No one. I lay back down but didn't sleep. The second time I woke up, I was sure I had heard breathing. Not my own. I held still. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't move. Eventually, it stopped. Or maybe I drifted off. I'm not sure. In the morning, I found prints. Same tread pattern. This time, only a few feet from my tent. I packed up fast. I didn't eat. I didn't even refill my water. I just got moving. The trail bent away from the stream and climbed sharply for the next few miles. I moved quickly, but I kept looking back. I didn't see anyone. Around noon, I stopped to rest and eat a protein bar. I felt exposed. The trees were thinner, and I didn't like sitting still. I moved on. Around mile 16, I found something that made me stop cold. A makeshift shelter. It wasn't on the trail. It was maybe 40 yards off in a thick patch of trees. Branches and bark had been leaned together in a sort of dome. There were old cans outside and a small fire pit. The ashes were recent, less than a day old. There was a scrap of fabric hanging from a tree branch nearby. Faded blue. I didn't get closer. I didn't want to know who had stayed there. I moved faster after that. My thighs were burning, my calves tight, but I didn't stop. Every now and then, I heard what I thought were footsteps behind me, matching mine. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they followed. But I never saw anyone. The trail looped back west on the last leg. I figured I had about 6 miles left. I had made good time, but I knew I wouldn't make it out before dark. I didn't want to stop. I considered going off trail, cutting straight toward the road according to the map. But that was risky. I didn't want to get lost, so I kept following the markers. I found the prints again around mile 20. Still fresh, same pattern, still going the same direction as me. That meant one thing: they were ahead now. I stopped and listened. Nothing, but something was off. The prints stopped at a tree, then nothing. No more forward steps, no backward ones either. It was like they just vanished, or stepped off. I looked up. Nothing in the branches, nothing above. I moved on faster now. About a mile from the end, the trail descended into a ravine, then climbed sharply up the other side. The light was fading. I felt it in my gut, that twisting tension like something was just over my shoulder. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see someone step out behind me, but the trail stayed empty. I made it to my car just before full dark. I didn't even take off my pack. I unlocked the door, got in, and drove. When I reached a small gas station 20 minutes out, I stopped. I went into the bathroom and looked in the mirror. My face was pale. My eyes looked wild. I hadn't realized how shaken I was until I saw myself. I filled up the tank, bought some food, and drove home without stopping again. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not at first. Not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't know how to explain it. There were no ghosts, no monsters, nothing supernatural, but I wasn't alone out there. Someone was in those woods, and they didn't want to be found. I don't know if they were watching me from the start or if I stumbled into something I shouldn't have seen. All I know is that the prints followed me for miles, came close to my tent, and then vanished. And that shelter, it wasn't old. Someone is living out there, away from people, and they don't like visitors. I haven't been back since, and I never hike without letting someone know exactly where I'm going now. It was real, and that's what makes it scarier than any ghost story I've ever heard. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the mountains, the rugged terrains, the whispering winds, and the sense of insignificance amidst towering peaks offered a kind of solace I couldn't find elsewhere. So, when I planned a solo hike through the lesser-known trails of the Karakoram Range in northern Pakistan, I was seeking that very solitude. The journey began smoothly. The trail was challenging but manageable, winding through dense forests and rocky outcrops. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the gravel and the occasional call of distant birds. On the third day, the weather shifted. Dark clouds gathered, and a sudden downpour turned the trail into a slippery mess. I decided to set up camp earlier than planned, finding a relatively flat spot under a canopy of trees. As night fell, the rain intensified, and the temperature dropped. The next morning, I resumed my trek, but the trail had become treacherous. Mudslides had altered the path, and I found myself navigating unfamiliar terrain. Around midday, I slipped on a wet rock, tumbling down a steep slope. When I came to a halt, pain shot through my leg. I had twisted my ankle badly, and walking became a challenge. 5 stunning real-life survival stories history. https://www.history.com/news/5-stunning-real-life-survival-stories?mark UTM_chat-gpt.com. I realized I was off the main trail. My GPS device had been damaged in the fall, and with the dense canopy above, my compass was unreliable. I was disoriented, injured, and alone. For 3 days, I rationed my supplies, hoping to find a way back. I fashioned a makeshift crutch from a sturdy branch and moved slowly, marking trees to avoid walking in circles. The forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle, which kept me on edge. On the 4th day, I stumbled upon a narrow stream. Following it seemed logical, as water sources often lead to human settlements. The journey was arduous, but the sound of flowing water provided a semblance of hope. The hiker's lapse, creepypasta, https://www.creepypasta.com/the-hikers-lapse/?source=chatgpt.com. By the sixth day, my food was nearly gone, and fatigue weighed heavily. Just as despair began to set in, I heard the distant hum of machinery. Summoning the last of my strength, I moved towards the sound and emerged onto a dirt road where a group of local loggers found me. They provided first aid and transported me to the nearest village, where I received medical attention. The experience was harrowing, but it reinforced the importance of preparation and respect for nature's unpredictability. I went on a solo hiking trip last September. I needed a break from everything. Work had been a mess, and I had just gotten out of a relationship that left me feeling like I didn't even know who I was anymore. I figured the best way to clear my head was to get away from all the noise, go somewhere far from the city, be alone for a few days, and try to reset. I had taken some time off work and picked a place I had never been before. It was a stretch of trails in northern Wyoming, near the Bighorn Mountains. I had found a few blogs talking about it, and one guy on a hiking forum had uploaded a GPS map with some recommendations. It looked perfect, quiet, remote, beautiful. I planned everything down to the smallest detail. I brought my usual hiking gear: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, a small gas stove, enough food for 5 days, my boots, some layers of clothes, a knife, bear spray, and a satellite GPS beacon. I had my phone with me, but I knew service would be spotty out there, so I wasn't planning to use it for much except photos. The plan was to park at a small trailhead outside a town called 10 Sleep, hike east for 2 days, loop south around the edge of a lake, and then circle back west over a ridge. It would be about 38 miles total. I started the hike early on a Tuesday morning. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of air that makes you feel like you're really out in the wild. The first few hours were uneventful. Trees lined both sides of the trail, mostly pine, and occasionally the trees would part and give way to wide-open clearings full of waist-high grass. I kept a steady pace, trying to make good distance before the sun got too high. By the time I stopped for lunch, I had already knocked out nearly 10 miles. The first night was peaceful. I set up my tent in a little grove just past a creek. I boiled water for some freeze-dried pasta and sat by the small fire I made with some dry twigs and pine needles. I watched the stars until my eyes got heavy, then zipped myself into my sleeping bag and drifted off. The sounds of the forest at night were familiar. Crickets, the wind pushing through the branches above, occasionally the rustle of something moving out in the dark, probably a raccoon or a fox. Nothing that made me nervous. The second day started off fine, too. I made a quick breakfast of oatmeal and dried fruit and packed up camp. The trail got steeper as I moved east, with more rock underfoot and fewer flat sections. There were times I had to slow to a crawl over some of the rougher terrain, but I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. I liked not having to think about anything but where I was placing my next step. In the early afternoon, I passed a fork in the trail. One path led north up to some old fire lookout point. The other kept heading east where I wanted to go. I checked the map, drank some water, and kept moving. That evening, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I imagined, more like a wide pond tucked between two ridges. Still, it was a beautiful place to set up camp. There was a small flat patch of dirt just above the shore. I pitched my tent there and cooked some soup. Everything felt good. I was tired, but in a satisfied way. I went to sleep early that night. The third day was where things started to shift. I woke up feeling uneasy, like something had brushed against my tent in the night. I opened the flap and looked around, but I didn't see anything. No tracks, no signs of animals. It was probably just a branch or a bird, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been close. I packed up and continued south along the trail. The weather had changed. Clouds were hanging low and thick overhead. The wind had picked up, cold and dry. The trees thinned out in that part of the trail, and I felt more exposed. I kept my bear spray clipped to my chest and walked faster than I normally would. I remember checking over my shoulder more often than usual. A few miles in, I came across something that didn't sit right with me. It was a pile of stones stacked neatly in a circle on the side of the trail. It looked deliberate, too deliberate. I walked past it, thinking maybe another hiker had left it as a marker or some kind of art, but about a quarter mile down, I saw another one. Same pattern, then another. None of them were in the middle of the trail, always just off to the side, but still visible if you were paying attention. I didn't want to let it bother me, but it did. Felt out of place. The trail was remote, yes, but these stacks felt like someone had been there recently. And that meant I wasn't as alone as I thought. For some reason, that thought didn't bring comfort. Around noon, I realized I hadn't eaten and forced myself to stop. I sat on a fallen log and pulled out some trail mix and jerky. I chewed slowly, listening. That was the first time I noticed how quiet it had gotten. No birds, no insects, just the wind. I moved quickly that afternoon. I kept expecting to see someone around the next bend. I don't know why, but I had this growing sense that someone was out there, maybe watching. I never saw anyone, though. No hikers, no animals, nothing. When I finally stopped to set up camp that night, I picked a spot well off the trail, hidden behind a rock outcrop. I didn't even cook dinner, just ate a protein bar and climbed into the tent. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound made me sit up. The wind rattled the sides of the tent like fingers brushing fabric. At one point, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. Not fast, not heavy, but slow and dragging. I held my breath and clutched the knife I kept in my pack. The sound faded after a minute or two, but I stayed awake the rest of the night. By the fourth morning, I wanted to be done. I didn't even bother boiling water for coffee. I stuffed everything into my pack and hit the trail before the sun was fully up. According to the map, I had about 12 miles left. I could make it in one day if I pushed. The trail climbed sharply toward the ridge. The higher I got, the worse the wind became. The trees swayed hard and loud, creaking like old doors. The trail narrowed along a steep slope, loose gravel underfoot. I took careful steps, planting my trekking poles with each move. Then I noticed something that made me stop cold. Ahead on the trail, maybe 50 feet, I saw boot prints, fresh ones. The soil was damp from the morning dew, and the tread was sharp. Someone else was on the trail. I crouched and studied the prints. They were heading the same direction I was. No sign of a return. For some reason, that made me feel worse. I wasn't sure if I wanted to catch up to whoever it was. I didn't want company anymore. I just wanted out. I kept moving, trying not to focus on the prints. A few miles later, I saw something that stopped me again. Hanging from a branch about eye level was a strip of fabric. Red, frayed at the ends. It looked like it had come from a jacket or a shirt. It wasn't old. The edges hadn't faded. I looked around. The trail was empty. I picked up the pace. The ridge was close. If I could make it there, I'd be able to see the valley on the other side and maybe even spot the trailhead in the distance. I moved fast, too fast in places. I slipped once, catching myself with my poles, my heart hammering. Every sound made me flinch. When I finally reached the top of the ridge, I stopped to catch my breath. The view opened up below me, a wide stretch of forest, a dirt road far off in the distance. Relief washed over me. I was close, maybe 4 more miles. But then I saw something else. Just off to my right, maybe 20 feet away, was a small fire pit. Fresh ash, unscattered. Someone had camped there recently, maybe last night. There were no signs of anyone now, but I didn't want to stick around. I moved on down the trail. I didn't see anyone the rest of the way. No figures in the woods. No more stacked stones. But the sense of being watched never left. When I reached the trailhead, I almost ran the last 100 yards. My car was still there. No damage, no signs it had been touched. I threw my pack in the trunk and got behind the wheel. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. Even now, months later, I think about that trip. I think about the footprints, the fabric, the fire pit, the stones. Someone was out there. Maybe more than one person. I don't know what they were doing, but I know I wasn't supposed to see it. I don't talk about this with people. Most would just say I spooked myself, that I was imagining things. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I haven't gone hiking alone since then. I still hike, but only with friends, and never off-grid. I stay where there are people, where there's cell service. That trip gave me what I wanted in a way, a reason to reset. A new appreciation for being careful, for not assuming you're alone just because you don't see anyone. The wild can be beautiful, peaceful even, but it can also hide things. And sometimes what it hides isn't nature. It's people. People who don't want to be found. People who might not want you there. I was lucky. I think about that a lot. I was lucky to walk out. I had always found solace in the mountains. The solitude, the crisp air, and the challenge of navigating rugged terrains offered a reprieve from the monotony of daily life. This time, I set my sights on the lesser-known trails of the Kamardaban mountain range in Siberia. The area was remote, sparsely populated, and promised the kind of isolation I craved. Kamardaban incident, https://in wikipedia.org/wiki/kamar-daban_source=chatgpt.com. Equipped with my backpack, essentials, and a detailed topographic map, I began my ascent early in the morning. The trail was narrow, flanked by dense coniferous forests, and the ground was damp from recent rains. Birdsong accompanied me, and occasional rustlings in the underbrush hinted at the presence of wildlife. By midday, I reached a clearing that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding peaks. I paused to hydrate and consult my map, noting that the next segment would involve a steep descent into a valley before ascending again towards the summit. The weather was overcast, and a chill had begun to set in, prompting me to don an additional layer. It snapped like a biscuit. 40 hikers who saw something truly terrifying. https://www.boardpanda.com/scariest-hiking-experiences/question mark UTM_source=chatgpt.com. As I commenced the descent, the trail became treacherous. Loose rocks and wet soil made footing uncertain. About halfway down, I stepped onto what appeared to be stable ground, only for it to give way beneath me. I tumbled several meters, coming to an abrupt halt against a protruding tree root. Pain shot through my left ankle. I attempted to stand, but the searing agony confirmed a sprain, if not a fracture. Panic threatened to set in, but I forced myself to remain calm. I assessed my surroundings. The trail above was inaccessible, and the valley floor was still a considerable distance below. Descending seemed the only viable option. Using a makeshift crutch fashioned from a sturdy branch, I began the arduous journey downward. Each step was a test of endurance, with pain flaring at every movement. The forest grew denser, and daylight waned, casting eerie shadows that danced with the swaying trees. As night approached, temperatures plummeted. I found a relatively flat area to set up a temporary shelter using my tarp and some branches. I managed to start a small fire, its warmth offering some comfort against the biting cold. Sleep was elusive, interrupted by the distant howls of wolves and the persistent throbbing in my ankle. The next morning, I resumed my descent. Dehydration and hunger gnawed at me, my supplies having dwindled faster than anticipated. By late afternoon, I reached the valley floor, where a narrow stream meandered through the landscape. I refilled my water bottle, purifying the contents with iodine tablets, and caught a glimpse of a faint trail on the opposite bank. Crossing the stream was another ordeal. Slippery rocks and a swift current tested my balance, but I managed to reach the other side without incident. The trail, though overgrown, provided a clearer path forward. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a ranger station or a frequented route. As dusk settled, I noticed signs of human activity, remnants of a campfire, footprints, and discarded food wrappers. Relief washed over me, and I decided to camp nearby, believing help was within reach. That night, the forest was alive with sounds. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. But exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. At dawn, I was awakened by voices. A group of hikers, startled to find me in such a state, offered assistance. They provided food, water, and, most importantly, a satellite phone to contact emergency services. Within hours, a rescue team arrived, and I was airlifted to the nearest medical facility. The ordeal left me with a fractured ankle, dehydration, and a newfound respect for nature's unpredictability. I had ventured into the wilderness seeking solitude and challenge, and while I found both, I also discovered the importance of preparation, caution, and the kindness of strangers. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the rugged landscape as I set out alone into the vast expanse of the desert canyon. The air was crisp, and the silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the sandy trail. I had ventured into this remote area seeking solitude and the thrill of exploration, confident in my abilities and the preparations I had made. As I navigated the narrow passages and towering rock formations, I felt a sense of awe at the natural beauty surrounding me. Hours passed as I climbed, descended, and squeezed through tight crevices, each turn revealing new wonders. I was in my element, completely immersed in the experience. However, as I attempted to descend a particularly steep section, a large boulder shifted beneath my weight. In an instant, it dislodged and pinned my right arm against the canyon wall. The pain was immediate and intense, and I realized with growing horror that I was trapped. The River Trail Creepypasta, https:/www.creepypasta.com/the-river-trail/question_source=chatgpt.com. Aaron Ralston, https://end wikipedia.org/wiki/Aaron_Ralston question _source=chatgpt.com. Panic set in as I assessed my situation. I was alone, miles from the nearest trailhead, and I had not informed anyone of my exact plans. My supplies were limited: a small amount of water, a few energy bars, and a multi-tool. I tried to free myself using all my strength to move the boulder, but it was immovable. As the hours turned into days, I rationed my supplies and attempted various methods to extricate myself. I used my multi-tool to chip away at the rock, but progress was minimal. Dehydration and exhaustion took their toll, and I began to experience hallucinations and a sense of despair. On the fifth day, realizing that my situation was dire, I made the difficult decision to amputate my trapped arm. Using the limited tools at my disposal, I performed the procedure, driven by the will to survive. The pain was excruciating, but adrenaline and determination carried me through. Aaron Ralston, https://end wikipedia.org/wiki/Aaron_Ralston question_source=chatgpt.com. After freeing myself, I rappelled down a 65-foot drop and hiked several miles before encountering other hikers who assisted me in getting help. I was airlifted to a hospital, where I received medical treatment and began the long process of recovery. Aaron Ralston, https://end wikipedia.org/wiki/Aaron_Ralston question_source=chatgpt.com. This experience taught me the importance of preparation, communication, and resilience. I now always inform others of my plans and carry more comprehensive emergency supplies. Despite the trauma, I continue to hike, embracing the wilderness with a newfound respect and caution. I had always been drawn to the solitude of nature, finding solace in the rustling leaves and the distant calls of unseen birds. The idea of hiking through the rugged terrains of Fort Monroe, Punjab, had been lingering in my mind for months. Known for its breathtaking landscapes and challenging trails, it promised the adventure I craved. I set out early one morning, the sun just beginning to cast its golden hue over the hills. My backpack was packed meticulously: water, energy bars, a first aid kit, a map, and a compass. I had informed a friend about my plans, ensuring someone knew my whereabouts. The air was crisp, and the scent of wildflowers filled my lungs as I began my ascent. The trail was narrow, winding through dense thickets and over rocky outcrops. Birdsong accompanied me, a melodic backdrop to the crunch of my boots on gravel. As I progressed, the path became steeper, demanding more of my strength and focus. Sweat trickled down my back, but the exhilaration of the climb kept me going. Around midday, I reached a plateau offering a panoramic view of the valley below. The vast expanse stretched out, dotted with clusters of trees and meandering streams. I took a moment to rest, sipping water and munching on an energy bar. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. 5 scary hiking stories, creepy tales from real hikers. https://outdoordept.com/scary-hiking-stories/question mark UTM_source=chatgpt.com. Continuing on, I noticed the trail becoming less defined. Faint markings on rocks and trees guided me, but they were sporadic. I consulted my map, aligning it with the compass, ensuring I was on the right path. The terrain grew more challenging, with loose rocks and sudden drops. As the sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows, I realized I needed to find a suitable spot to set up camp. A small clearing nestled between 2 large boulders caught my eye. It offered some shelter from the wind and a relatively flat surface. I pitched my tent, gathered some dry wood, and started a small fire. The warmth of the flames was comforting as darkness enveloped the landscape. I cooked a simple meal, savoring the hot food after a long day. The stars emerged, twinkling in the clear sky, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures began to fill the air. Despite the isolation, I felt at peace. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a distant sound, a low, guttural growl. My heart raced as I strained to listen. Silence followed, but the unease lingered. I reminded myself that wild animals were part of the ecosystem here. Ensuring my food was secured, I tried to return to sleep. Morning brought a sense of normalcy. The sun's rays filtered through the trees, and birds chirped cheerfully. I packed up and resumed my hike, determined to reach the summit. The trail became increasingly treacherous, with narrow ledges and steep inclines. At one point, loose gravel gave way beneath my foot, causing me to stumble. I managed to regain my balance, but the incident left me shaken. 5 scary hiking stories, creepy tales from real hikers. https://outdoordept.com/scary-hiking-stories/question mark UTM_source=chatgpt.com. As I neared the summit, clouds began to gather, and the wind picked up. A sudden downpour ensued, drenching me within minutes. Visibility decreased, and the trail became slippery. I decided to find shelter and wait out the storm. A small overhang provided some protection, and I huddled beneath it, shivering. The rain persisted for hours, and as evening approached, I realized I wouldn't make it to the summit that day. I set up camp under the overhang, using my emergency blanket to retain warmth. The storm's fury continued through the night, with thunder echoing through the mountains. Sleep was elusive, and I kept a vigilant watch. By morning, the storm had subsided, leaving a misty landscape. I decided to begin my descent, prioritizing safety. The trail was muddy, and progress was slow. At one point, I noticed fresh paw prints, large and distinct. They weren't there the previous day. A chill ran down my spine as I realized a predator had been nearby. I quickened my pace, alert to every sound. The forest seemed more menacing now, each shadow a potential threat. Suddenly, a rustle to my left caused me to freeze. I turned slowly, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Telling myself it was just the wind, I continued. 5 scary hiking stories, creepy tales from real hikers. https://outdoordept.com/scary-hiking-stories/question mark UTM_source=chatgpt.com. Hours later, I reached a familiar landmark, a large, twisted tree marking the trailhead. Relief washed over me as I realized I was close to safety. Soon, I emerged from the forest, the sight of my parked car bringing a smile to my face. Reflecting on the journey, I recognized the importance of preparation and respect for nature's unpredictability. The experience had tested my limits, both physically and mentally. While the memories of that eerie night lingered, they served as a reminder of the wild's raw power and the resilience it demands. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the mountains. The idea of disconnecting from the world, even if just for a few days, was appealing. So, when I planned a solo hike in the remote stretches of the northern wilderness, I was seeking peace, not peril. I spent weeks preparing for the journey. Topographic maps were spread across my living room floor, compass and GPS devices were tested, and my backpack was meticulously packed with essentials. Food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, extra clothing layers, and emergency supplies. I informed a close friend about my itinerary, emphasizing the importance of checking in upon my return. The first 2 days were uneventful. The trail was challenging but manageable, winding through dense forests and ascending rocky terrains. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the path and the occasional rustle of wildlife. I felt invigorated, embracing the solitude and the rhythm of the hike. 10 essential tips for crafting effective horror stories. Hidden Gems book blog. https://10gemsbooks.com/10-tips-for-crafting-horror-stories/question mark UTM_chatgpt.com. On the third day, the weather shifted unexpectedly. Dark clouds gathered, and a sudden downpour drenched the landscape. I hastily set up my tent on a relatively flat area, hoping the storm would pass quickly. Inside, I changed into dry clothes and tried to stay warm, but the temperature dropped rapidly. The wind howled, and rain battered the tent, making sleep elusive. By morning, the storm had subsided, leaving behind a misty, slick terrain. I packed up and resumed the hike, but the path was treacherous. Moss-covered rocks and muddy slopes made footing uncertain. While navigating a steep descent, I slipped. My ankle twisted unnaturally, and a sharp pain shot through my leg. I cried out, the sound swallowed by the vastness around me. Kamardabin incident. https://end wikipedia.org/wiki/kamar-dabin_incident?UTM_source=chatgpt.com. Assessing the injury, I realized I could still move, but with difficulty. I fashioned a makeshift brace using a sturdy branch and some cloth from my pack. Each step was agonizing, but I was determined to reach a safer area. Progress was slow. The pain in my ankle was constant, and the uneven terrain exacerbated it. I rationed my food and water, aware that the journey back would take longer than anticipated. Nights were the hardest. Alone in the darkness, every sound seemed amplified. The isolation weighed heavily, and doubts crept in. On the 5th day, while resting near a stream, I noticed movement in the distance. A group of hikers appeared, their bright clothing a stark contrast to the muted tones of the forest. Relief washed over me. I called out, and they approached, concerned and attentive. After explaining my situation, they assisted me, sharing their supplies and helping me navigate the remaining distance to the nearest ranger station. At the station, medical personnel examined my ankle, confirming a severe sprain. They commended my preparedness and resilience, noting that my prior planning had been crucial in ensuring my survival. I contacted my friend, who had been growing increasingly worried due to my delayed return. Back home, I reflected on the experience. The mountains had tested me, pushing me to my limits both physically and mentally. While the journey hadn't gone as planned, it reinforced the importance of preparation, adaptability, and respect for nature's unpredictability. I knew I'd return to the trails someday, carrying the lessons learned and a renewed appreciation for the wild. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the mountains. The idea of disconnecting from the digital world and immersing myself in nature's raw beauty was both therapeutic and exhilarating. So, when I planned a solo hike through the remote trails of the Karakoram Range in northern Pakistan, I was filled with anticipation. The trail I chose was less traveled, known for its challenging terrain and breathtaking vistas. I had prepared meticulously, packed enough food for 5 days, carried a reliable GPS device, a satellite phone for emergencies, and informed a close friend about my itinerary. The plan was to hike from the village of Askol to the base camp of K2, then loop back through a different path. Day 1, the ascent begins. The journey started smoothly. The weather was clear, and the trail, though rugged, was manageable. I passed by glacial streams, crossed wooden bridges, and marveled at the towering peaks that surrounded me. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of my boots on gravel and the occasional chirping of birds. The river trail creepypasta, https://www.creepypasta.com/the-river-trail/question _source=chatgpt.com. By evening, I set up camp near a small stream. The night sky was a tapestry of stars, and the air was crisp. I felt a deep sense of peace as I drifted to sleep, the gentle gurgling of the stream serving as a lullaby. Day 2, into the wilderness. The next day, the trail became steeper and more challenging. Loose rocks and narrow paths demanded constant attention. Around midday, I noticed the weather changing. Dark clouds gathered, and a cold wind picked up. I quickened my pace, hoping to find a suitable spot to set up camp before the weather worsened. By late afternoon, snow began to fall. Visibility decreased, and the trail became slippery. I found a small overhang that provided some shelter and decided to wait out the storm. As night fell, the snow intensified. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, hoping the storm would pass by morning. Day 3, lost and alone. Morning brought a white landscape. The trail was obscured, and my GPS device struggled to get a signal. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked unfamiliar. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. I attempted to use my satellite phone, but it too failed to connect. I decided to move downhill, reasoning that I might find a village or at least a recognizable landmark. The descent was treacherous. Loose rocks gave way underfoot, and the snow concealed hidden crevices. By evening, I was exhausted, cold, and still disoriented. Day 4, the injury. While navigating a narrow ledge, I slipped. I managed to grab onto a protruding rock, but not before twisting my ankle badly. Pain shot through my leg, and I knew it was more than a sprain. I couldn't put weight on it, which severely limited my mobility. I constructed a makeshift crutch from a sturdy branch and continued slowly. Hunger gnawed at me. My food supplies were dwindling. I rationed what little I had left, hoping to find help soon. Day 5, signs of life. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I spotted a faint trail, boot prints in the snow. They were fresh, indicating someone had passed through recently. I followed them, hope rekindled. After hours of painstaking progress, I heard the distant sound of voices. I shouted, my voice hoarse. Moments later, 2 local shepherds appeared. Their eyes widened in surprise upon seeing me. They approached cautiously, and though we didn't share a common language, their concern was evident. They offered me water and food, then helped me to their nearby shelter. Using their radio, they contacted the nearest village, and arrangements were made for my evacuation. Recovery and reflection. Back in the village, I received medical attention. My ankle was fractured, but with proper care, I would recover fully. The villagers were hospitable, offering me warmth, food, and stories of their own experiences in the mountains. Join the author on a gripping narrative journey as they recount a hiking trip turned nightmare, where a simple goodbye to a beautiful landscape becomes a struggle for survival. https://ellieTridings.com/essays/narrative/a-terrifying-hiking-experience-trap-in-the HTML ? UTM source =chatgpt.com. The ordeal taught me the thin line between adventure and peril. Preparation is vital, but nature is unpredictable. I was reminded of the importance of humility and respect for the wilderness. While the experience was harrowing, it reinforced my appreciation for life and the kindness of strangers. I returned home with a deeper understanding of my limits and a renewed commitment to safety in future adventures.